One of the men laughed loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. "A veterinarian," he said, the word dripping with contempt. "He really married a woman who washes dog blood off her hands for a living." Another voice followed, quieter but crueler, and a black American at that. What was he thinking? Nyla Mercer heard every syllable. She kept walking, leather medical bag in her hand, back straight, face still. Because breaking in front of these men would have cost her something, she refused to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd found the crack. She had come to sign divorce papers. She hadn't come to bleed. But here's what none of those men knew, what even her husband didn't know, as she pushed open that heavy glass door and stepped into the cold Busan rain. She was 11 weeks pregnant, and she'd already decided to disappear. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, 'cause this story is only just beginning. And drop your city or country in the comments. I genuinely want to see how far this reaches. Now let's go back to where it all started. The rain over Busan that morning had the particular cruelty of rain that doesn't announce itself, no thunder, no dark sky warning. Just a cold curtain that soaked through your coat before you realized it had started. Nyla Mercer stood outside the building for exactly 11 seconds. She counted because that was something she had trained herself to do in moments when her body wanted to do something. Her mind wouldn't allow scream, cry, turn around and walk the other direction. She counted. She breathed. She gave herself 11 seconds. Then she pushed through the lobby doors. The building was Kang Tae-jin's headquarters in every sense of the word, not officially, of course. On paper, it was a financial consulting firm with 47 legitimate employees and a tax record so clean it gleamed. But everyone in certain circles knew what the upper floors represented. The money that moved through those offices had not always started its life as clean money. The lobby smelled like money, too. Not the new money smell of cologne and marble, but the older, heavier kind polished wood and recirculated air, and the specific stillness of a place where people chose their words very carefully before speaking them. Nyla had been here 3 times before. She had never once felt welcome. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. 3 men from the senior staff got in behind her. She recognized 2 of them advisors who had attended Tae-jin's formal gatherings with expressions of practiced respect toward their boss and barely concealed indifference towards his wife. She faced forward, pressed the button for the 14th floor, watched the numbers climb. That was when one of them started talking. Not quietly, not with any particular attempt at discretion. He really brought her all the way here to sign papers in person. The first man said in Korean, the kind of casual Korean that assumes the foreigner beside you understands nothing. Suppose he owed her that much. Owed her? The second man made a sound. She should be grateful. 5 years, a comfortable apartment, clothes she couldn't have afforded on a veterinarian's salary. A veterinarian. The third voice, the one Nyla had already identified as belonging to a man named Park, choked out a small laugh. Do you remember when he brought her to the harbor dinner? She spent 20 minutes talking to Councilman Wu's wife about heartworm prevention. The laughter that followed was quiet, conspiratorial. The kind that men use when they believe they are alone. Nyla's fingers tightened around the strap of her medical bag. The bag was old. The leather had cracked at the corners and been restitched twice. She had bought it during her 2nd year of veterinary school, with money she'd saved from 3 months of weekend shifts at a grocery store, and it had been with her through 2 continents, 4 clinics, and every significant moment of her adult life. These men would not understand that. These men understood cost, not value. She listened to the rest without expression. She heard the comment about her skin. She heard the suggestion that Tae-jin had made the marriage for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with the kind of international legitimacy that came from an American wife with a professional degree. She heard Park wonder aloud whether Tae-jin had simply gotten bored. The elevator stopped. 14th floor. Nyla stepped out first. She walked the length of the corridor without slowing, without looking back, without doing anything that would have told those 3 men that a single word had reached her. But something had shifted in her chest during that elevator ride. something that had been leaning, uncertain, toward grief made a quiet, irreversible decision. She was not going to cry in this building. She was not going to cry anywhere they might see. Tae-jin's office occupied the northeast corner of the 14th floor, and the view from it, on clear days, was extraordinary. Busan's coastline, the container ships moving through the port, the particular blue of the Korea Strait in afternoon light. Today, gray rain pressed against the glass. The city beyond it was a blur. Tae-jin stood with his back to her when she entered. He was 40 years old, and the years had not softened him. They had compressed him, refined him into something harder and more contained than the man she had first met at a gallery opening in Seoul 8 years ago. She had not known then what he was. She had known only that he was the most controlled person she had ever encountered, and that his particular kind of stillness had struck her as interesting in a way she hadn't been able to fully explain. Now she knew what that stillness cost him. She knew what it cost the people around him, too. He turned when he heard her set the medical bag down on his conference table. Nyla's voice was careful, neither warm nor cold. The voice he used when he had prepared himself. "The papers?" she said. He gestured toward the table. The documents were already there, 2 sets, the relevant pages already flagged with small yellow markers. His attorney had prepared everything, of course. Tae-jin did not leave administrative details to chance. She picked up the pen. She signed where she was supposed to sign. Her handwriting was steady. She had practiced being steady for so long that she no longer had to think about it. When she set the pen down, Tae-jin picked it up and signed his copies without pause. Just like that. 5 years of marriage dissolved between one breath and the next. "You'll be safer when you're no longer my wife," he said. She looked at him directly for the first time since entering the room. "You've decided that?" "Yes," without asking me. Something moved across his face, quickly controlled. "The situation has changed. There are people who what? Tae-jin?" Her voice was still even. "Who might hurt me? Who might use me to get to you? Because that's been true for 4 of the 5 years we've been married. You didn't divorce me, then." He didn't answer, and that was the answer. Something had changed recently, something specific, and he had made a calculation, the same kind of cold, strategic calculation he made about everything, and the result of that calculation was that she needed to not be his wife anymore. She had not been consulted. She had never been consulted. She picked up her medical bag. Tae-jin exhaled. She had heard that sound before, the slow, measured release of breath that happened when a problem had been resolved, when a decision that had been troubling him was finally executed. To Nyla, standing 3 feet away with her signed divorce papers and her battered leather bag and her 11-week secret, it sounded like relief. "Take care of yourself," she said, because she was still, even now, the kind of person who said things like that. She walked out. She did not look back. She did not count to 11 this time. The motel Nyla checked into that night was 40 minutes from the headquarters by bus, in a part of Busan that had no reason to know who Kang Tae-jin was. The room had water stains on the ceiling and a window that looked out onto a parking structure. The television picked up 6 channels, 3 of which were shopping programs. She sat on the edge of the bed with the ultrasound photograph in her hands. It was small, grainy, the kind of image that required someone to tell you what you were looking at before the shape resolved into anything recognizable. But Nyla had been staring at this particular piece of paper for 3 weeks, and she no longer needed anyone to explain it to her. 11 weeks. She had found out the week before Tae-jin told her he wanted a divorce. She had been trying to find the right moment to tell him, running the conversation in her head, imagining his face, the careful, controlled face, softening into something she saw only in private, only when he had decided she was the only one watching. She had been rehearsing for a different story entirely. Now she sat in this motel room and understood that the story had changed. She made herself think, not feel. She could feel later, she promised herself that, but think. A divorced wife could still be used against him. His enemies would not honor a legal document. The divorce might remove her from his protection, but it would not remove her from their calculations. Not once they discovered she had been close to him for 5 years. Not once they discovered there was a child. His child. A child would not be a loose end. A child would be a weapon. Nyla turned the ultrasound photograph over in her hands. She thought about the men in the elevator. She thought about the way Tae-jin had exhaled. She thought about the 4 years she had spent learning to read rooms, learning to identify exits, learning to recognize the particular quality of silence that preceded danger skills she had acquired. Not from any training, but from simply paying attention to the world her husband moved through. She pressed the photograph flat against the bedspread and looked at it one more time. Then she picked up her phone and called the only person she trusted. Ryu Song-ho answered on the second ring, which was unusual. Song-ho was a man who typically made you wait for 4 rings as a matter of principle, some old habit from his early years, when answering too quickly signaled either anxiety or nothing better to do. 2 rings meant he had been expecting her call. "Where are you?" he said. "A motel. It doesn't matter where." She kept her voice low even though the walls were thin and the parking structure outside was empty. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "I always tell you the truth." "No," she said. "You tell me what you think I can handle." "That's different." She heard him take a breath. "What changed, Song-ho?" "Something changed recently. Something that made him decide the divorce had to happen now." "What was it?" "Silence. Not the silence of a man who didn't know. The silence of a man deciding how much to say." "Murion," Song-ho said finally. The name was familiar to Nyla in the way that certain names become familiar to the wives of powerful men she had heard it occasionally. Noticed the way conversation shifted slightly when it came up. Observed the minor alteration in Tae-jin's expression whenever the subject arose. "He's been watching you," Song-ho said. "Not watching Tae-jin. Watching you. For about 4 months. Tae-jin found out 6 weeks ago and decided a divorce would protect me. He believed that if you were no longer his wife, I would stop being useful to his enemies." She said it flatly. "He thought a piece of paper would protect me. He thought removing the formal connection would reduce your value as a target." "And you," she said. "What did you think?" Another silence. Shorter this time. "I thought he was wrong," Seong-ho said. "But Tae-jin does not often ask my opinion on matters he has already decided." Nyla looked at the ultrasound photograph. "I need help," she said. "I know. The kind of help that means you don't tell him." This silence was the longest. "Nyla, he made a decision about my life without helping me," she said. "I'm making a decision about mine. I need documents. I need money that can't be traced. I need roots." She paused. "And I need you to understand that if you tell him before I'm gone, I will never forgive you, and I think you know that matters to me." She could hear Song-ho breathing. She waited. "How far?" he asked. "Far enough that Murion stops being able to find me." "That's not a distance," Song-ho said. "That's a principle." "Then I need you to help me make it a distance." They met the following morning at a small restaurant that Song-ho trusted because he had been using it for 20 years, and the owner had every reason to be discreet and no reason to be otherwise. Seong-ho looked older than Nyla remembered, which was strange because she had seen him only 2 weeks ago at one of Tae-jin's dinners. But grief and loyalty existed in that man's face in layers, and sometimes, depending on the light, you could see them all at once. He put an envelope on the table between them. Inside a passport, 2 other identity documents, a small phone with a prepaid SIM card and nothing else on it, and more cash than Nyla had expected. "The name is Jennifer Park," he said. "Korean mother, American father. The documents are not perfect, but they are very good. Good enough for the places you'll need to go." She looked at the passport photograph. Her face stared back at her under a different name. "Japan first," Seong-ho said quietly. "Then you decide. Don't stay anywhere more than 6 weeks in the beginning. Don't contact anyone from your current life. Change your appearance as soon as you can, not dramatically, just enough. You've thought about this already." "I've been thinking about it," he said carefully, "since he told me what he was planning to do." She looked up at him. "You knew he was wrong," she said. "From the beginning." "Yes, but you didn't stop him." "Cannot stop Kang Tae-jin from a decision he has made." Seong-ho's voice was not apologetic, exactly. It was honest, which was, she had learned, his version of apology. "What I could do was prepare for the consequences of the decision." She reached into her coat pocket and put the ultrasound photograph on the table between them. Sunso looked at it for a long time. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes changed considerably. 11 weeks, she said. He doesn't know. You were going to tell him. Before he handed me the divorce papers? Yes. She picked up the photograph. Now I'm not telling anyone, Nyla. His voice was careful. It changes everything, she agreed. That's why I'm giving this to you instead of destroying it. I need someone to know. She held it out toward him. Keep it. And someday, not now, not for a long time, let him find it. Seong-ho took the photograph from her hand. He studied it one more time. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. Not yet, he said. Not yet, she agreed. They sat for another 20 minutes, and Seong-ho told her everything she needed to know about moving through the world without leaving traces, the patterns that surveillance operations typically looked for, the mistakes that people on the run most commonly made, the places and systems that were safer than others. He spoke like a man who had spent 30 years in a particular kind of world and had always quietly been keeping track of the exit routes. When she stood to leave, he didn't hug her. That was not something Seong-ho did. But he looked at her for a moment in a way that said more than most people managed with embraces. Be harder than you think you are, he said. I've been practicing, she told him. She walked out. 3 days later, Nyla Mercer, carrying a battered leather medical bag, a prepaid phone, a passport that said Jennifer Park, and a secret that was 11 weeks and 4 days old, boarded a ferry leaving Busan Harbor. She did not look back at the city. She didn't have to. She had memorized what it looked like. Japan was cold. She found a small clinic outside Osaka, whose owner, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Tanaka, asked very few questions and paid in cash on Fridays. Nyla was careful not to be exceptional competent, reliable, invisible. The kind of employee who showed up and did the work and didn't invite conversation. She cut her hair 2 weeks after arriving, not dramatically. Shorter and without the careful shaping she had maintained during her marriage. It looked like a woman who didn't have time for maintenance, which was exactly what she had become. She moved every 6 weeks, as Song-ho had told her to. Osaka to Kyoto. Kyoto to a smaller city she found on a map specifically, because she had never heard of it before. Then, when the pregnancy began to show in ways that would soon require explanation, she to herself find a clinic and sit through a prenatal appointment under Jennifer Park's name. The doctor was efficient and impersonal, which was what Nyla needed. The baby was healthy. She sat in the parking lot afterward and allowed herself 5 minutes of what she had been suppressing since the Busan motel room. Not grief. Exactly, not anymore. Something more complex. Something that had been grief when she started and had slowly, under the pressure of weeks of motion and necessity, compressed itself into something denser. Something harder to name, but harder to break. She called Song-ho from the prepaid phone. I'm fine, she said before he could ask. I know you are. A pause. He's looking. Already? He started the day after you left. She had expected this. She had not expected the particular feeling. It produced not satisfaction, not fear, but something caught between them. He was looking for her. Tae-jin, who had signed divorce papers, with what sounded like relief, who had made a unilateral decision about her safety without her input, who had spent 5 years treating her life like a logistical problem to be managed rather than a life to be shared, that man was now apparently burning resources to find the woman he had just legally discarded. Good, she said. She wasn't sure what she meant by it. She found copper in China 3 months after leaving Japan. She had taken a position at an understaffed clinic in a mid-sized city, the kind of place that needed hands and didn't require much background. She had been working there for 2 weeks when she first noticed the dog. He was large, mixed breed, with reddish-brown fur going gray at the muzzle, and the patient, permanent look of an animal that had been waiting too long for something it had stopped believing would arrive. Every morning he's sitting outside the clinic entrance when she arrived. Every evening he was still there when she slocked up. She asked around. Nobody knew who he belonged to. The staff assumed he had adopted the clinic as a territory, which happened sometimes. They fed him scraps intermittently and otherwise left him to it. Nyla sat beside him on the clinic steps one afternoon and looked at his face. There was something in his expression that she recognized the particular dignity of a creature that had been abandoned and had decided not to make a scene about it, not to whine, not to demand, just to wait in a specific place and maintain what it could of its routine. She recognized it because she had been doing the same thing. "You're coming with me," she told him. He looked at her. "I know we're moving again soon," she said. "That's fine. You'll get used to it." He seemed to consider this. Then he moved closer to her on the step. She named him Copper because of his fur, and because she had always liked the idea of something that could conduct electricity, transmit heat, age into a different beauty. He was old, and arthritic, and not entirely house-trained, and absolutely terrible to travel with. She loved him immediately. The pregnancy was the loneliest part. She could not discuss it with anyone. She could not call her mother back in Georgia, not because her mother would have betrayed her, but because involving her mother would have put her mother in Tae-jin's path when he came asking, and he would come asking. She knew him well enough to know that. She could not call her college friends, her colleagues from a previous clinic in Seoul, anyone from her visible life. She had Song-ho, monthly calls, never more than 4 minutes, from rotating phones. And she had Copper, who slept against her legs as her stomach grew, and who seemed, in the specific way of dogs who have survived abandonment, to understand that his job was simply to remain. Mara was born on a Tuesday afternoon in a small hospital in Central Europe, in a country that Nyla had chosen specifically because its border controls were careful, its hospital system was functional, and nobody there had any particular reason to know or care about Korean criminal politics. Nyla had prepared for the birth the way she had prepared for everything in the preceding months, methodically, without sentiment, accounting for every complication she could anticipate. What she hadn't accounted for was the sound. The specific sound of her daughter crying for the first time, an outraged, furious, absolutely determined announcement of existence, broke something open in Nyla that 5 years of marriage and 6 months of running had not been able to touch. She held Mara against her chest and looked at her face. Dark skin, her skin, and her father's eyes not yet storm gray, the way they would become, but already carrying some structural quality that Nyla recognized immediately, a particular shape to the lid, a slightly wider spacing. Tae-jin's eyes in her daughter's face. Nyla held her and breathed and didn't cry until the nurses had left the room. Then she cried until she didn't have anything left. Then she wiped her face on the hospital sheet and looked at Copper, who was technically not allowed in the hospital room and had been snuck in under Nyla's extremely firm assertion that she was a veterinarian and the animal was a medical necessity. "Her name is Mara," she told him. Copper put his chin on the edge of the hospital bed and exhaled. It sounded like sepsis. Seong-ho left the ultrasound photograph where Tae-jin would find it on a gray Thursday morning, 14 months after Nyla disappeared from Busan Harbor. He slid it into a folder of documents that Tae-jin would review before a morning meeting. Nothing dramatic, no note attached, just the photograph, in its original condition, with Nyla's handwriting on the back in small, precise letters, 11 weeks. JK, just kidding. She had written, in her private way, and then crossed it out. Kidding was what you said when you wanted to take something back. She hadn't wanted to take it back. She had wanted him to understand exactly how it landed. He had looked at it for a long time. Seong-ho watched from the doorway as Tae-jin's expression moved through stages that Seong-ho had never seen on that face before, not in 30 years of knowing the man. He watched calculation dissolve into comprehension, and comprehension dissolve into something entirely unguarded. Tae-jin looked up. "How long have you had this?" he said. Song-ho didn't answer. Tae-jin looked back at the photograph. "She was pregnant," he said. Not a question. Processing. "Yes." When she came to yes. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences Song-ho was accustomed to from this man. Usually Tae-jin's silences were strategic. This one had no strategy in it at all. "She's been running," Tae-jin said finally. "This whole time. Not just from," he stopped. Set the photograph on the desk. "She's been running with the child. Yes, my child. Yes. Tae-jin stood very still for a moment. Then something happened to the careful, controlled, compressed man who had built a criminal empire on the principle of never losing composure. He sat down heavily in his chair, put his elbows on the desk, and pressed his face into his hands. It lasted about 8 seconds. When he looked up, the control was back. But it was different now, the same structure, different contents. Find her, he said. He didn't say please, because he had never been good at that word. But Seong-ho heard it anyway, underneath all the other words. He had always been better than Tae-jin at hearing things that weren't quite said. I'll try, Seong-ho told him. He knew, even then, that trying was going to be the most complicated thing he had done in 30 years. Because Nyla had learned well, and she had not left them anything easy to follow. And somewhere in Europe, a little girl with her father's eyes was sleeping in a cramped apartment, and her mother was double-checking the locks on the door, and neither of them was going to be easy to find. Not because they were hiding from the wrong man, but because the right one had taken too long to understand what he had sent away. The search for Nyla Mercer lasted 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days before Tae-jin stopped counting the days. He didn't stop because he had given up. He stopped because counting had become a kind of punishment he was inflicting on himself, and even he had limits to how long he could sustain a particular form of self-destruction before it started costing him things he couldn't afford to lose. But in those early months before the counting stopped, it was something close to obsessive. He had resources that most governments would have envied. He had operatives in 12 countries, relationships with intelligence contractors who asked no questions, and enough money to keep all of it running for years without the organization feeling the drain. He deployed everything. Every lead dissolved the moment it became solid. Every sighting resolved into a different woman, or a trail that ended at a border crossing with no record on the other side. Every network he activated came back with variations of the same answer. She had been here, and then she had not been here, and nobody knew exactly when the transition happened. This was not the behavior of a frightened woman who had run in a straight line. This was systematic, deliberate, almost professional. Tae-jin stood in his office 3 weeks after finding the ultrasound photograph and told Chung-ho that Nyla had been trained. By whom? Song-ho said. By me, Tae-jin said. Or by watching me. For 5 years. Song-ho said nothing. She knows how surveillance works, Tae-jin continued. She knows how to change patterns before they become predictable. She knows which systems can be traced and which can't. He turned from the window. I built the cage she learned to escape from. Song-ho had an expression he used for moments when he agreed completely with something that gave him no satisfaction at all. He was using it now. Then approach it differently, Song-ho said. Don't look for where she is. Look for what she needs. What she needs. She's a veterinarian. She has a child. She has to work. She can't live entirely on what Song-ho stopped. Tae-jin looked at him. The pause had lasted a fraction of a second too long. On what you gave her, Tae-jin said. Song-ho kept his expression steady. You helped her, Tae-jin said. Not a question this time. Yes. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was not meant to be. Song-ho had known this conversation was coming since the day he put the ultrasound photograph in that folder, and he had decided he would face it without apology. Because apologizing would imply he believed he had done something wrong, and he did not believe that. You helped her run from me, Tae-jin said. I helped her run from the consequences of your decision, Seong-ho said. There's a difference. Tae-jin's jaw tightened. You should have told me she was pregnant. She asked me not to. You work for me. I have worked for you for 30 years, Song-ho said, and his voice did not rise, did not waver, held the particular measured weight of a man who had thought carefully about every word before saying it. In those 30 years, I have never once done something that was actually against your interests. Helping her was not against your interests. It was the only available action that protected your child from Murion's network, while you were still deciding that a divorce would solve everything. Tae-jin stared at him. Song-ho stared back. This was one of perhaps 6 conversations in 30 years where they had looked at each other with something that required both of them to decide how important the relationship was before either of them said the next thing. She would have been taken, Sang-ho said, if she had stayed. If she had been visibly pregnant and newly divorced and therefore no longer under your protection. Murian was already watching her. You know that. You knew it when you made the decision to divorce her. He took one breath. What you didn't account for was what a pregnant woman with no formal protection and no warning becomes in that context. I accounted for it. Tae-jin turned back to the window. Outside, Busan was doing its ordinary morning business trucks on the coastal road, containers moving through the port, the indifferent machinery of a city that had no interest in his problems. Where did you send her? He said. I gave her routes, Seong-ho said. Not destinations. I told her how to move, not where. I genuinely don't know where she is now. But you've been in contact. Occasionally, Seong-ho paused, she calls. Short calls. She tells me she's fine. She doesn't tell me where. And you didn't push. No. Tae-jin pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. A gesture Seong-ho had seen before. In the years when Tae-jin was younger and less controlled, in the years before the empire had taught him that visible stress was a liability. It was a gesture that meant he was at the edge of what his composure could hold. Find me something, Tae-jin said. Anything. Whatever she needs: veterinary licensing, hospitals, school registration. If the child is old enough, look for patterns. Don't look for Nyla. Look for a woman who behaves like her. Sang-ho nodded. He left without either of them saying anything else, because there was nothing else to say yet, and because Seong-ho had always understood that the most important part of 30 years of loyalty was knowing when to simply leave the room. Mara turned one in a small apartment in Prague. There was no party. There was a cake that Nyla made from ingredients she had to look up because she had never baked a cake from scratch in her life. The result was structurally unstable and slightly too dense, and Copper ate the piece that fell on the floor before Nyla could stop him. Mara seemed genuinely delighted by the entire catastrophe. She had her father's eyes in full color by now, that specific gray, the color of seawater in winter, unusual enough that strangers sometimes paused when they looked at her, trying to understand what they were seeing in a child with dark skin and that particular gaze. Nyla had a story ready. Half Korean, half American. Her father worked overseas. She didn't see him much. All of it technically true, in the way that the most useful lies were built on true things arranged carefully. Prague suited them in its way. It was a city that had been through enough of its own history that it had developed a professional incuriosity about the personal histories of the people who moved through it. Her clinic work was steady. She had found a position at a practice near the river whose owner was more interested in her skills than her paperwork, which was the only kind of employer she could afford. She cleaned offices 3 nights a week for additional income and told herself this was temporary without fully believing it. Copper slept by the radiator and aged gracefully, which was more than she could say for herself. She called Seong-ho on the first Monday of each month, from a phone she purchased new each time at different shops around the city. He's still looking, Seong-ho told her on one of those calls, about 18 months after Prague. I know, she said. He's using different methods now. Not direct tracking. Pattern recognition. How close? Pause. Not close, but smarter. She ended the call and sat for a moment with Mara asleep in the next room, and Copper's slow breathing the only sound in the apartment, and thought about what Seong-ho meant by smarter. Tae-jin learning from failure was Tae-jin at his most dangerous. She changed her routine the next morning. Different route to work. Different market for groceries. She had been going to the same bakery on Thursday mornings for 2 months, which was 2 months too long for any single habit. She was tired. She was genuinely, bone-deep tired in a way that she hadn't fully admitted to herself until that moment on the apartment floor, with Copper's breathing and Mara asleep, and the particular quiet of a life that had been constructed entirely out of discipline and necessity and very little joy. She missed things she hadn't expected to miss. She missed her mother's voice. She missed the specific smell of her veterinary school classroom in autumn. She missed having a friend she could call at midnight because she was having a bad night, not because she needed to pass-coded information under a time limit. She didn't miss Tae-jin. She told herself that regularly. Some nights she almost believed it. Han So-yeon had worked for Kang Tae-jin for 9 years, and in those 9 years, she had built herself into something indispensable through a combination of genuine financial brilliance and the specific patience of a person who had decided very, very early that the distance between where she was and where she intended to be was simply a question of time and leverage. She was 36 years old. She dressed with the kind of precision that communicated authority without inviting comment. She had an MBA from a university that Tae-jin's people had initially dismissed until the quality of her work made the dismissal embarrassing, and she had never once mentioned this. She had also been feeding information to Jang Moo-ryeon for approximately 3 years, not out of ideology, not out of personal hatred, though she had reasons for that too. Out of calculation, the same cold structural calculation that everything else in So-yeon's life proceeded from. Tae-jin was searching for Nyla. Tae-jin distracted was Tae-jin manageable. A man whose emotional center of gravity was aimed at a missing woman on another continent was a man who needed people he trusted to hold the day-to-day architecture of his organization together. People like So-yeon. The arrangement with Moo-ryeon was elegant in its simplicity. So-yeon would receive advance notice whenever Moo-ryeon planned to move against the organization's legitimate business interests, which gave her time to protect those interests and therefore demonstrate her value to Tae-jin. In return, whenever Tae-jin's search got close to producing a result, So-yeon would inform Moo-ryeon, who would take action to ensure the result evaporated. Everyone got something. So-yeon got proximity to power and time to consolidate it. Moo-ryeon got a wounded, distracted rival who could be slowly starved of momentum. And Tae-jin got to keep searching. So-yeon watched Tae-jin search from her position in the financial operations with the detached interest of someone monitoring a chess game they had already determined the outcome of. And she was very careful never to let any of this read in her face or her behavior, because Seong-ho was watching. And Seong-ho had always been better than people assumed at seeing things that were not meant to be seen. She was careful about Seong-ho. He had never liked her, in the particular way that people who are skilled at reading character never liked her with politeness, so precise it functioned as a wall. She had learned to conduct herself around him as though she were performing for a very attentive audience. For 3 years, the performance had been adequate. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th year, Song-ho called her into his office. He didn't call her to his office often. They operated on parallel tracks within the organization, and their overlap was primarily bureaucratic. So Tian straightened her jacket in the hallway and walked in with the expression she used for professional interactions: open, composed, attentive. Song-ho was standing at his desk. He had a folder in his hand. He didn't offer her a seat. "You authorized the payment to Kessler Consulting last March," he said. Kessler, a private intelligence contractor that she had used for a specific purpose she had told Tae-jin, was related to due diligence on a European banking partnership. "Correct," she said. The work order referenced Central European surveillance operations. Due diligence often requires the target in the work order, Song-ho said, setting the folder on the desk between them, was a woman named Jennifer Park. He paused. "That name doesn't appear in any of our banking partners' documents." So-yeon looked at the folder. She kept her breathing even. "I must have don't," Song-ho said, one word. "Quiet." "Absolute." So-yeon closed her mouth. Song-ho looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him before, which was what happened when a man who had been patient for a very long time decided he was finished being patient. "The work order is dated 11 days after Tae-jin received intelligence, placing Nyla in the Prague area," Song-ho said. 11 days. Not long enough for you to complete due diligence on any banking partner. Long enough to commission surveillance on a specific individual and forward the results to someone who would prefer that Nyla not be found. "Songlong?" he said. She calculated. She was very fast at calculating, and what she calculated in that moment was that denial had a cost, that the folder on the desk represented documentation she hadn't known existed, and that Seong-ho had not brought this to Tae-jin first, which meant he was giving her a choice he didn't have to give her. 3 years, she said. The silence was extraordinary. 3 years, Seong-ho repeated. The arrangement was mutually protective. Murion agreed not to move against our core operations. In exchange for you telling him whenever Tae-jin was close to finding his child. Seong-ho's voice had not risen. It was worse than if it had risen. 3 years. Every time he was close. You told Murion. I protected the organization's financial. You protected your position, Seong-ho said. You kept him searching because a searching man is a distracted man, and a distracted man needs people he trusts to hold things together. And you decided that person would be you. He picked up the folder. This is not protecting the organization. This is an architecture for taking it. So Yeon said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would help. I haven't told him yet, Seong-ho said. She looked up. I'm telling you that because what happens next depends on whether you understand what you've actually done. He put the folder under his arm. You kept a child away from her father for 3 years. Whatever your calculation was about Tae-jin and the organization, you kept a child away from her father. Do you understand what he will do when he knows that? So Yeon understood. She understood it with the specific clarity of a person who had spent years studying Kang Tae-jin and knew exactly what he was capable of when the damage was personal. What do you want? She said. I don't want anything from you, Seong-ho said. I'm going to tell him tonight. I'm informing you first because you need to decide what to do with the hours between now and then. He walked to the door. Seong-ho, she said. He stopped. You have no proof that I passed specific intelligence to Murion. The work order is, I have more than the work order, Seong-ho said. I have been watching you for 14 months. He opened the door. Proof is sufficient. He left. So Yeon stood in his office for approximately 30 seconds after the door closed. Then she walked back to her own office, sat at her desk, and began making phone calls. Not to Murion, not yet. To the people she had spent 3 years quietly, positioning as loyal to her. Because if Seong-ho was going to tell Tae-jin tonight, she had hours. And So Yeon had always known what to do with hours. Seong-ho told Tae-jin that evening. He laid it out, without emotion, without editorial, with the precision of a man delivering a structural report on a building that had been quietly compromised at its foundation. He showed Tae-jin the folder. He showed him the work orders, the communication records he had spent 14 months assembling, the financial transfers, the timeline. He showed him exactly how many times Nyla had almost been found. He showed him exactly how many times So-yeon had made sure that finding didn't happen. Tae-jin sat through the entire presentation without speaking. His face did something during those 40 minutes that Seong-ho had only seen twice before. In 30 years, it became genuinely still. Not the practiced, controlled stillness of a man managing his expression. The different stillness. The stillness that happened when something reached a place so deep that the surface had nothing left to do. When Seong-ho finished, Tae-jin asked one question. Is Nyla currently in danger? Yes, Seong-ho said. Murion has independent surveillance on Prague. Whatever So-yeon told him, he has been maintaining his own search. He is close, possibly days. Tae-jin stood up. Then I need to be in Prague, he said. There's something else, Seong-ho said. Tae-jin looked at him. Nyla called me this morning. Seong-ho chose his next words carefully. She's seen surveillance. Outside her clinic, she knows someone has found her, but she doesn't know yet whether it's you or Murion. Both, Tae-jin said. Yes. She'll run. She's been running for 5 years, Seong-ho said. She knows how. Call her. Tae-jin was already moving toward the door. Tell her he stopped. Put one hand flat against the door frame. Something working through him that he wasn't going to show Seong-ho, but that required a moment to let pass. Tell her to stay exactly where she is. Tell her I'm coming. Tell her another pause. Shorter. Tell her she has my word. She may not accept that, Seong-ho said. I know. He left. Seong-ho sat alone for a moment in the quiet office. Then he picked up his phone. Nyla was at the clinic when the call came, in the middle of suturing a cut on a gray cat whose owner had brought it in, wrapped in a kitchen towel, crying in the way that people cry about animals when they're actually crying about something else. She managed the cat with one hand and checked the phone with the other, saw Sung-ho's number, and felt the specific quality of cold that she had learned to associate with his unexpected calls. 1 second, she told the cat's owner. She stepped into the back hallway and answered. Tell me, she said, instead of hello. There are 2 surveillance teams outside your clinic, Song-so said. Not 1. 2. She had seen one. She had identified the car 2 days ago, parked at the corner with rotation patterns she recognized. She had begun the process of preparing to leave. Who is the second? Kessler Consulting, a private intelligence firm that, he paused, and she heard in the pause something being decided. That was commissioned by someone inside Tae-jin's organization. The hallway was cold. The old building's heating system had an unresolved argument with the radiators on this side of the building. Someone inside his organization, she repeated slowly, has been helping Mu Rion find me. Yes, she closed her eyes. Opened them. How long? 3 years. 3 years. She leaned her back against the wall and thought about the times in the last 3 years, when she had moved the feeling, twice, that she had moved slightly too soon, slightly in advance of a pressure she couldn't quite identify. She had attributed it to instinct. She had attributed it to experience. It had been a mole, inside Tae-jin's own operation, feeding her location to his rival, every time he had gotten close. He doesn't know, she said. He's been searching honestly. Every lead that went cold was cold because someone made it cold, Song-ho said. Yes, something complicated moved through Nyla that she didn't have time to examine. Something adjacent to grief and adjacent to rage, and not quite either. He's coming to Prague, Song-ho said. Tae-jin, he wants you to stay where you are. That's not his decision. Nyla, is Mara safe? She said. Right now at this moment, is she safe? She's at your apartment. There's no surveillance on the apartment yet, only on the clinic. But Mu Rion's team will expand. How long do I have? Hours. Maybe less. Nyla looked at the wall in front of her. There was a veterinary anatomy chart pinned to it, slightly crooked, that had been there since before she started working at the clinic. She had straightened it twice, and it had gone crooked again both times. She thought about what 5 years had cost. She thought about what the next decision was going to cost. Tell him, she said, that I will not stay. Tell him that I will move Mara tonight, and that if he is in Prague tomorrow, I will decide at that point whether I trust him enough to tell him where we are. Nyla, Mu Rion. I know what Mu Rion is. I've known what Mu Rion is for 5 years. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Tell Tae-jin that if he wants to find us, he needs to be faster this time. Tell him that's not an insult. It's a fact. She hung up. She went back into the treatment room, finished suturing the cat, told the owner it would be fine, charged her a reduced rate, because the woman clearly didn't have much money, and the cat was the most important thing in her life, and then locked the clinic, packed her bag, and walked out the door, at exactly the pace of someone who had done nothing unusual today, and was simply going home. She did not look at the car at the corner. She felt it watching her. She kept walking. Mara was awake when Nyla came through the door. She was 5 years old, and she should have been asleep. She was sitting on the floor of the living room, with a drawing she'd been working on, and she looked up with her father's eyes and said, "You have your fast face on," with the complete matter-of-factness of a child who has spent her entire conscious life learning to read her mother's expressions. "I have my regular face," Nyla said. "Your regular face and your fast face look the same, but your regular face doesn't have the thing around your eyes." Nyla crouched down in front of her. "We're going to take a little trip tonight," she said. Mara looked at her steadily. "How little?" "Probably Vienna." "Is someone looking for us?" "Always," Nyla said, because lying to Mara had never felt like an option she could sustain. "But tonight it's closer than usual. So we're going to go somewhere safer while we figure it out." Mara looked at the drawing in her hands. "Can I bring this?" "Yes." "And Copper?" Copper was already standing at the door with the expression of a dog who understood that the appearance of the packed bags meant something was happening, and he intended to be part of it. "Copper goes everywhere we go," Nyla said. Mara rolled up the drawing carefully. She was precise about her drawings, had always been precise. She inherited that. Nyla thought, and then pushed the thought away because there was no time for it. They were out of the apartment within 20 minutes. The night train to Vienna left at 11:40. They were on it. And in the seat across from them, a man in a coat that was slightly too large for him seemed to be sleeping. And Nyla watched him for the first 40 minutes of the journey with the specific attention she had developed over 5 years of watching for things that didn't quite fit, and she decided eventually that he was genuinely asleep and not a threat. But she didn't sleep herself. She sat with Mara's head on her shoulder and Copper's weight against her feet and watched the dark landscape move past the window. And she thought about the phone call from Seong-ho, and she thought about 3 years of someone inside Tae-jin's organization, pointing Murion at her like a finger. And she thought about the 11 weeks and the grainy ultrasound, and the sound Tae-jin had made when he exhaled. She thought about the fact that he had been searching honestly. She thought about what that meant. She had spent 5 years building her understanding of that exhale as the sound of a man relieved to be free. She had used that understanding to fuel the discipline of the running, the loneliness of the false names, the cramped apartments, the cash job, the 3 in the morning moments when Mara was sick and Nyla had no one to call. If he had been searching, honestly, if every failure had been manufactured by someone inside his own walls, then the exhale had been something else. She didn't know what yet. She wasn't ready to know what yet. The train moved through the dark and outside Vienna, in a farmhouse that Song-ho had arranged through a contact whose name Nyla had not been given. A woman named Yoon Hae-rin was waiting with coffee, and the specific expression of someone who had spent too many years on the wrong side of something and had recently decided that the cost of staying was higher than the cost of crossing. And somewhere above them, on a flight from Seoul to Vienna, Kang Tae-jin sat with his hands flat on his knees and his eyes open, and the folded ultrasound photograph in his jacket pocket, the one he had carried for 14 months, and told himself that this time he would not be too late. He had no way of knowing yet whether that was true. He had no way of knowing that by the time he landed, Nyla and Mara would already be at the farmhouse, and Murion would already be moving, and the last clear road back would be closing behind all of them like a door. The point at which any of them could have turned around had already passed. It had passed, in fact, on a rainy morning in Busan, in a glass-walled office, when a man exhaled and a woman walked out, and neither of them said the thing that would have changed everything. What remained now was only forward, and forward, in the hours approaching dawn over Central Europe, was about to get extraordinarily dangerous. The farmhouse outside Vienna smelled like old wood and cold coffee, and the particular stillness of a building that had been waiting empty for too long. Yoon Hae-rin had arrived 3 hours before Nyla and Mara, which was exactly how she had planned it. She was 31 years old, and she moved through spaces the way people move when they have spent years in environments where being slow meant being caught efficiently, without wasted motion, checking angles before she committed to crossing them. She had worked for Murion's European logistics network for 4 years. She had stopped believing in the work somewhere, in the 3rd year, quietly, without announcement. The way belief usually dies not in a single moment, but in a slow accumulation of small things that the mind keeps filing away until the drawer won't close anymore. The drawer had stopped closing the night. She watched Murion threaten a dockworker's family in Hamburg because the man had miscounted a shipment by 3 units. The wife, the 2 kids, Murion had not touched them. He hadn't needed to. He had simply described, in patient and specific detail, what would happen if the dockworker failed him again, and the children had been in the next room, and the walls were thin, and Hae-rin had been standing close enough to hear the youngest one start crying. She had driven back to her apartment that night and sat at the kitchen table until 4 in the morning, thinking about the children in the next room. After that, it was just a matter of waiting for the right moment and the right person. Song-ho had been the right person. She had known his name for years. Everyone in Murion's network knew Kang Tae-jin's strategist by reputation. She had made contact through a channel that had taken her 6 weeks to construct, and Seong-ho had listened to what she had to offer without surprise, which told her he had been waiting for exactly this kind of asset for some time. She had given him 3 months of documentation before he trusted her enough to give her this assignment. protect a woman and a child. Get them to this farmhouse. Wait, she could do that. She checked the window again, the long dirt approach road, the tree line, the gray Austrian dawn coming up slowly over flat fields. Nothing moving. She poured another cup of coffee from the pot she had made on arrival, sat at the kitchen table, and waited. The sound of a car on the road came at 6:30. She was at the window before the engine sound fully resolved. One vehicle, moving at the pace of someone who knew the address and was not trying to be quiet about it, which was the behavior she had been told to expect. The car stopped. Doors opened. A woman got out first, lean and watchful, with the compressed alertness of someone who had been running long enough that vigilance had become indistinguishable from breathing. Then a child, small, dark-skinned, with eyes that caught the early light in a way that made Hae-rin look twice. Then a large, reddish-brown dog who stepped out of the car with the deliberate dignity of a very old animal who had decided that whatever was happening, he would participate in it at his own pace. Nyla Mercer looked at the farmhouse. Then she looked at Hae-rin in the window. Their eyes met through the glass. Hae-rin raised one hand. Nyla nodded once. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee and the remains of the bread Hae-rin had brought, and Hae-rin told Nyla what she knew about Mu-ryon's current operation. Not everything she told her what was immediately relevant, which was that Mu-ryon's team had tracked the night train to Vienna and had a secondary contact in the city who would begin active search operations within hours of the train's arrival. He doesn't know about this specific location, Hae-rin said. Not yet. The farmhouse is registered to a name that has no connection to anyone in either network. We have time, but not much. How much? If we're careful, a day. Maybe 36 hours. Nyla looked at the table. Mapra was in the next room with Copper, examining the old farmhouse with the investigative energy of a 5-year-old, encountering somewhere new. Her voice drifted through the wall, occasionally questions to the dog, observations about the furniture, the specific running commentary of a child who had learned early that silence in a new place was worth breaking carefully. Seong-ho said someone inside Tae-jin's organization has been feeding information to Mu-ryon, Nyla said. Han So-yeon, Hae-rin said. Nyla looked up. Hae-rin folded her hands around her coffee cup. I've known her name for 8 months. She's been one of Mu-ryon's most valuable assets without ever formally joining his network. She doesn't operate like an informant. She operates like someone who decided whose side she was going to be on before anyone knew there were sides. Does Tae-jin know? Song-ho told him last night. That's why he's on a plane. Nyla absorbed this. She thought about So-yeon. She had met the woman 4 times during her marriage, at organizational dinners and 1 formal reception. So-yeon had been impeccably professional, impeccably dressed, and completely unreadable in the way of people who have decided that being readable is a tactical disadvantage. Nyla had not liked her, specifically because she could not find anything to dislike, no obvious fault line, no visible agenda. Just the smooth, frictionless surface of someone who was very good at presenting exactly what they chose to present. She had mentioned this to Tae-jin once. He had said So-yeon was one of his most effective people. He had not said she was trustworthy. Nyla realized now. He had said effective. 3 years, Nyla said. At least Hae-rin said. The documentation I've seen goes back 3 years on the regular information sharing. But the initial contact may have been earlier. 3 years of Tae-jin's search being systematically sabotaged. 3 years of getting close and finding nothing. 3 years of a man chasing his own tail while the woman controlling the leash stood behind him and called it loyalty. Nyla stood and walked to the window. The fields outside were going from gray to pale gold as the sun came up. It was genuinely beautiful in the flat, uncomplicated way of agricultural land in early morning, the kind of beauty that had no agenda. He's going to arrive and find nothing, she said. He'll go to Prague. The apartment will be cleared out. He's not going to Prague, Hae-rin said. Song-ho told him you were moving. He's coming here. Seong-ho gave him the location. Nyla turned from the window. There was something in her face that Hae-rin couldn't entirely categorize, not fear, not anger, something more complicated that required more context than Hae-rin had. He didn't ask me, Nyla said. Hei-rin blinked. He's trying to... He didn't ask me if I wanted him to know where we were. Her voice was steady, but there was something under it. Someone else had that decision. Again, someone else deciding what's best for me. She pressed one hand flat against the window frame. That's how we got here. That's the whole mechanism. Men deciding what's safest for me without asking me what I want. Hei-rin was quiet for a moment. The alternative, she said carefully, was you and Mara facing Murion's network, with 36 hours of lead time and a farmhouse. I know, Nyla said. I know that. She took a breath. Doesn't change what it feels like. She dropped her hand from the window frame. How long until he gets here? 3 hours, maybe 4. He landed 2 hours ago. Nyla nodded. She straightened her posture in the particular way. She had developed not performance, not pride, the practical adjustment of someone who had learned that how you held your body affected what your mind believed was possible. Then we use the time, she said. Tell me everything you have on Murion's operation. Not just what's immediately relevant. Everything. Hei-rin looked at her. All right, she said, and reached for the folder she had brought. Murion received the call at 7:40 in the morning, Vienna time. He was in a hotel suite that cost more per night than most people earned in a month, and he was eating breakfast with the methodical attention of a man who believed that eating well in uncertain times was a form of discipline, and his contact's voice came through the phone with the specific flatness of someone delivering disappointing news carefully. The woman and the child had not been at the Vienna train station when the train arrived. He set down his fork. Explain, he said. The contact explained they had covered all exits. The woman had not appeared. The dog had not appeared. The child had not appeared. A review of the train's passenger manifest obtained through a contact in Austrian Rail's administrations showed that a passenger named Jennifer Park had boarded in Prague and the ticket had been used. But the woman who had walked off that train at Vienna Hauptbahnhof did not match the physical description they had been working from. Someone else had traveled under the ticket. She switched, Murion said. Apparently between Prague and at a stop. She exited at an intermediate stop and put someone else on the train with the ticket. He picked up his fork again. Set it down again. She's not in Vienna. We're working to determine. Work faster, he said, and ended the call. He sat for a moment with his hands on the table and his breakfast going cold in front of him and thought about what kind of woman spent 5 years learning to move like this. He had studied Nyla Mercer extensively in the past year. He had expected to find someone who had survived through luck, and Seong-ho's assistance, a frightened woman, making frightened decisions, improvising, one step from breaking. What the surveillance reports had shown him instead was something that bothered him, in a way he didn't fully acknowledge to himself, a woman who had gotten measurably better at this over 5 years. Not just maintaining competence, improving. She had made a mistake in Prague. She had stayed too long, allowed routine to develop. But she had identified the surveillance within 2 days of it being established, which was faster than most professionals managed. She had then executed a departure that required her to be 2 steps ahead of a team that was watching her. And she had done it with a 5-year-old child and an elderly dog. Murion had a particular category of respect that he reserved for people who consistently performed above their apparent capacity. He did not enjoy adding Nyla Mercer to it. He picked up a different phone and made a different call. Tell me about the farmhouses, he said. All properties within 90 minutes of Vienna that have any connection to Seong-ho's network. Start there. Tae-jin arrived at the farmhouse at 9:17 in the morning. He came alone, which was unusual enough that Hei-rin had her hand near the inside of her jacket when his car appeared on the approach road. But the car was the model Seong-ho had described, and the man who got out of it moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned that unnecessary motion was a liability. He was not what Hei-rin had expected. She had built a picture of Kang Tae-jin from 4 years in Murion's network, where he was discussed with the specific combination of respect and resentment that powerful rivals always generated. She had expected something more performatively imposing, the kind of man who wore his authority in his posture, who made you feel his presence as a kind of pressure. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been awake for 30 hours on a transatlantic flight and had spent the hours not sleeping thinking about things that didn't resolve neatly into rest. He stood outside the car and looked at the farmhouse, and Hae-rin watched him from the window register the details, the way a professional registers details exits, angles, the position of the parked vehicles, the question of what was in the barn. Then the farmhouse door opened. Nyla stood in it. Hae-rin had positioned herself in the kitchen doorway, close enough to observe the entrance without appearing to supervise it, and she watched what happened between them with the attention of someone cataloging things for later use. They stood about 12 feet apart. Neither of them moved toward the other. It lasted long enough that Hae-rin found herself holding slightly more breath than was comfortable. Tae-jin's face did something complicated. He had the particular look of a man whose control was holding, but only because he had spent the last several hours reinforcing it specifically for this moment. Nyla's face was more opaque. She was looking at him with an expression that required too much context to decode quickly. "You're alone," she said. "Yes, Song-ho wanted to come. I told him not to." A pause. "I thought I didn't want it to feel like an operation." Something shifted in Nyla's expression. Not softer. More focused. "Come inside," she said. "We don't have much time and there are things we need to discuss." He followed her in. He stopped just inside the door when he saw Copper, who had risen from his position near the radiator and was conducting the specific investigation that old dogs conduct when encountering new presences: slow, thorough, nose-led, without particular alarm. Tae-jin looked at the dog. Then he looked at the doorway to the next room, and Hae-rin watched something move across his face that had nothing to do with control, a pure involuntary thing, because Mara had appeared in the doorway. She was small and precise and awake, and she looked at Tae-jin with her father's eyes and the particular evaluative focus of a 5-year-old who has learned that new adults in unfamiliar circumstances require assessment. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Mara said, "You have the same eyes as me." And Tae-jin crouched down until they were level and said yes, with a voice that was doing an enormous amount of structural work behind one syllable. And Hae-rin quietly moved deeper into the kitchen, because what happened next was not for her to witness. They sat at the kitchen table 20 minutes later, Nyla and Tae-jin, while Mara drew in the next room, and Copper had returned to his position near the radiator, and Hae-rin's spread the documentation she had brought across the kitchen table between them. Tae-jin looked at it without touching it first. He was cataloging. Hae-rin recognized the specific quality of attention, the way an experienced operator read a room of information, not sequentially but structurally, looking for the architecture first and the details second. "This is his European network," Hae-rin said. "Safe houses, personnel, financial routing, primary and secondary communication channels. 4 years of operational data. I didn't take it at once I accumulated it." She paused. "I can transmit all of it simultaneously to law enforcement contacts in 6 jurisdictions. His entire European operation dissolves overnight." Tae-jin looked at her. "Why?" he said. "Because I watched him threaten children," she said. "And I got tired of knowing that and not doing anything about it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Nyla. "And you trust her, more than I trust most people I've known longer," Nyla said. Something almost like acknowledgement in his expression. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you're proposing." Hae-rin told him. The transmission would happen simultaneously from 3 independent servers. She had independent servers. Lun, Murion couldn't suppress all of them in time. The jurisdictions involved were Austrian, German, French, Dutch, Belgian, and Interpol. The volume of documentation was sufficient that even partial review would generate immediate action. But it required timing. If Murion had any warning, he would burn the network himself and rebuild underground. It had to happen when he was exposed, when he was somewhere identifiable, in circumstances where the authorities could move on the documentation and on him simultaneously. "You need to draw him out," Nyla said, looking at Tae-jin. "Or draw him to me," Tae-jin said. "You're going to use yourself as bait," Nyla said. He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "No," she said. "Nyla." I said no. Her voice was not loud. It was the particular firmness that comes from having had this argument before, in a different form, and knowing exactly where it led. You're not going to sit in this kitchen and construct a plan that you're going to execute without me. That's how we ended up in this situation in the first place. You made a decision. You didn't consult me. You signed those papers and exhaled like a problem had been solved. You don't get to do that again. The room was very quiet. Tae-jin looked at her. I'm not trying to... What were you trying to do? She said, when you signed those papers. His jaw moved. I was trying to protect you, without asking me if I wanted that kind of protection. You would have argued. Yes, I would have argued. And maybe you would have been right, and maybe I would have been right, and we would have found something in the middle that neither of us would have arrived at alone. But you didn't give us that chance. She set her hands flat on the table. I am not your problem to solve, Tae-jin. I am not your liability. I am not the thing you failed to secure. I am the person who spent 5 years keeping our daughter safe while you were looking for us. So when you sit in this kitchen and start building a plan, you build it with me. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Tae-jin looked at the table. When he looked up, something in his face had changed, not the control. That was still there. But the thing it was controlling had shifted. Tell me what you think we need, he said. And it was not a performance of listening. It was actual listening, which was a different thing. And Hae-rin, who had been watching this exchange with the specific attention she had developed for reading people under pressure, recognized the difference immediately. They talked for 40 minutes. The plan that emerged was not his plan. It was not her plan. It was the plan that came out of the argument, and the correction, and the moments where one of them said something the other hadn't thought of. Mara and Nyla would go with Hae-rin to a location that only Hae-rin knew. Not a safe house in any network. A private address, personal, belonging to someone Hae-rin trusted outside of any professional context. Tae-jin would remain at the farmhouse. Murion would find it. He was good enough that he would find it. And when Murion arrived, the documentation would already be transmitting. There was also the question of a man named Choi Jun-suk. Hae-rin mentioned him carefully. He was young, 24-25, and he had been working as a logistics coordinator in Murion's European network for 2 years. He had come in differently than most of Murion's people, recruited not through the usual criminal pathways, but through financial desperation, a family debt situation that Murion had deliberately engineered and then offered to resolve. He had been efficient and reliable, and had spent approximately 18 months being quietly miserable about it. He had contacted Hae-rin 6 weeks ago. He wants out, she said. What does he want to do about it? Tae-jin said. He's positioned to coordinate the convoy Murion will send ahead of himself. He can, with instruction, create enough delay and confusion in that convoy to give us the timing window we need. Can we trust him? Nyla said. He's scared, Hae-rin said. Scared people are unpredictable, or they're extremely motivated, Nyla said. Tae-jin looked at Hae-rin. Get him on the phone. Call with Jun-sik lasted 11 minutes. He had a young man's voice with an older man's exhaustion in it, and he answered Tae-jin's questions directly, which was either a sign of honesty or very good preparation. And in either case, the answers were consistent and specific enough to be credible. If you're inside the convoy coordination, Tae-jin said, and you delay them, what's your exit? I have a car positioned 2 kilometers from the staging point, Jun-suk said. Austrian plates, I drive northwest. I have an address. How long have you been planning this? A pause. Since March. You've been sitting on this for 5 months. I needed to be sure, Jun-suk said. You understand needing to be sure before you move. Tae-jin was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. When the call ended, Hae-rin looked at Tae-jin. He'll hold, she said. If he doesn't, Tae-jin said, then none of the rest of it matters. It was said without self-pity, which was the only way he said things, and Nyla heard it from across the table and understood that he meant it literally. If Jun-suk's nerve broke, the convoy arrived unimpeded, and Murion came into the farmhouse with 11 men and no external pressure. In that situation, the documentation's transmission might still happen. Hae-rin had built the servers to operate independently, but the jurisdictions needed time to act on it, and time was not something that would be available in that farmhouse. She understood, in other words, that the plan required Tae-jin to be in an extremely dangerous location with a degree of protection that depended entirely on a 24-year-old man's courage, holding under pressure. She understood this, and she had agreed to the plan anyway because it was the best plan available. But Blizz, that life in the world she had been living in for 5 years, did not offer better options, only different risks. But she sat with it for a moment. Tae-jin, she said. He looked at her. She wanted to say something that acknowledged what was true, which was that she had carried 5 years of anger and 5 years of running and 5 years of being so comprehensively alone that she had learned to think of loneliness as a baseline condition. She wanted to say that she understood now, after Seong-ho's call, that the exhale on that morning in Busan had not been the sound she had decided it was, and that understanding this did not fix anything, but it changed the shape of what needed fixing. She wanted to say these things. She said, "Don't die in this farmhouse." He held her gaze. "I'll do my best," he said. It was not a promise, because he was not a man who made promises he wasn't certain he could keep, and she had always, even in the worst years, respected that about him. She stood. They had 30 minutes before Hae-rin needed to move Nyla and Mara. Nyla went to the next room, where Mara was sitting with Copper and her drawing, and crouched beside them, and said they were going on another small trip. Mara rolled up her drawing. "Is the man with my eyes staying here?" she said. "For a little while." "Why?" "Because there are some things that need to be finished," Nyla said. "And he's going to help finish them." Mara looked at the doorway to the kitchen. "He looks tired," she said. "He's been looking for us for a long time," Nyla said. Mara considered this, with the gravity she applied to significant information. "We should have left a note," she said. Nyla looked at her daughter's face. "We should have," she said, "but we're here now." Murion's people found the farmhouse at 2 in the afternoon. Not through any failure of concealment, through the simple brute efficiency of having enough people, covering enough ground that the probability of missing it became very small. A contact in the local land registry cross-referenced with a list of properties connected to names in Seong-ho's known network, and one address produced a match on a third-degree connection. Property owned by a company registered to a man who had once done legal work for a firm that Seong-ho used 20 years ago. 3 degrees. 20 years old. But Murion had people who looked for exactly this kind of residue. He received the confirmation at 2:12. He assembled his team. He was not in a hurry because hurrying produced mistakes, and he had not reached his position by making mistakes. He moved methodically, with the patience of someone who had been outmaneuvered repeatedly in this particular chase, and had decided that patience was now the appropriate response. He did not know about Jun-suk's arrangement. He did not know about the servers. He did not know that Han So-yeon's financial access to Tae-jin's organization had been frozen at 9 that morning. When Song-ho executed the operational controls, Tae-jin had authorized before boarding his flight. What he knew was this: Kang Tae-jin was in that farmhouse. His ex-wife and daughter were presumably nearby or possibly inside. And the situation was, for the first time in 5 years, contained. He put on his coat. He told his 11 men to move. And in the farmhouse kitchen, Kang Tae-jin sat alone with Hae-rin, who had refused to leave before the transmission was confirmed, and a pot of cold coffee, and the particular silence of 2 people who had committed to something and were now waiting for it to arrive. The servers began transmitting at 2:47. Murion's convoy hit the delay Jun Ji-suk had arranged at 3:04. Murion himself arrived at the farmhouse at 3:31, 11 men behind him, furious at the delay, and about to become significantly more furious. He pushed open the farmhouse door. He expected Nyla. He expected Mara. He expected Tae-jin cornered and desperate and willing to make a transaction. What he found instead was Tae-jin standing in the middle of the kitchen with no visible weapon and no expression that suggested he was either cornered or desperate, and behind him, a laptop displaying a transmission progress bar at 89% complete. Murion looked at the laptop. He looked at Tae-jin. "You've been here this whole time," he said. "Not running. Not hiding." His voice carried the particular tone of a man processing, something that has just invalidated a large number of assumptions. You stayed. Yes, Tae-jin said, while she ran. She didn't run, Tae-jin said. She finished what needed finishing. And then she left. Murion looked at the laptop again. The bar read 91%. He pulled out his phone. The call he made to his network's financial controller lasted 4 seconds before the controller told him that his European accounts were already frozen, pending law enforcement review, that the German authorities had issued a warrant 30 minutes on, and that the Belgian office had been contacted as well. Murion stood very still. The bar on the laptop read 94%. You gave them everything, Murion said. Not me, Tae-jin said. Someone who watched you threaten the wrong people one too many times. Murion's face went through something then, not fear. Exactly. Because he had spent enough of his life in dangerous situations, that fear had been refined into something more functional, a calculating cold that ran very fast behind his eyes. He was looking at the numbers. He was looking at the laptop. He was looking at 11 men behind him, and 1 man in front of him, and an empire that was dissolving at 96%. He abandoned strategy. He nodded once, and the 11 men moved. The kitchen became something that happened too fast, to track cleanly bodies in motion. The specific violence of close quarters, where there was no room for technique, and everything was impact and angle, and the question of who stayed standing longest. Tae-jin took the first 2 men in the same motion, used the kitchen table as a barrier, and then as a weapon, and was catching his breath against the counter when a third came through at an angle he hadn't covered and hit him across the shoulder with something heavy enough to make the joint go briefly wrong. He stayed standing. Hae-rin handled herself. She was not a fighter in any trained sense, but she had the specific usefulness of someone who understood space and had positioned herself with her back to the server equipment, which protected the one thing that absolutely could not be interrupted. The bar read 99%. Tae-jin had blood in his mouth from a collision he didn't fully remember, and his shoulder was sending information to his brain that he was choosing not to process yet, and he looked across the chaotic kitchen at Murion, who had not joined the physical engagement but had produced a pistol and was now holding it with the careful calm of a man who had decided to end the operational complexity of the situation. Murion reached into his jacket. He produced a small device, a transmitter, clip-on, the kind used for broadcast to secure feeds. He clipped it to his lapel. There are people watching this right now, Murion said. His voice was even. It was the voice he used when he was performing as much as operating. 15 years of building an empire, reduced to this because of a woman. He raised the pistol. Kneel. Tae-jin did not kneel. Murion moved the pistol slightly. Kneel, he said. Let them see it. Let everyone watching understand what your choices cost you. Tae-jin looked at the transmitter on Murion's lapel. He thought about the people watching, the network contacts, the criminal infrastructure across a dozen countries, the men who calculated power by what they observed rather than what they were told. He thought about Mara in a car with Hae-rin's contact, driving somewhere northwest, Copper's chin on her knee, asking the questions she always asked in cars. He looked directly at the transmitter, and then Kang Tae-jin, who had spent 15 years building an identity around never bowing to anyone, who had constructed an entire philosophy of self around the principle that the only things worth holding were the things you could hold. Standing up, he went to one knee. Not quickly, not in collapse, deliberately, the way a man kneels when he has chosen to do so, which is a different thing entirely from being forced. Murion blinked. The calculation in that blink was visible even across the room. He had expected resistance, had expected the performance of defiance, had expected Tae-jin to give him something to overcome. He had not expected choice. For her, Tae-jin said, quietly enough that only the transmitter and the immediate room could hear. Not for you, for my daughter. Murion raised the gun. The farmhouse door opened. Jun-suk stood in it. He was breathing hard, coat dirty from the field, hands shaking with the specific tremor of someone who has run further and faster than they expected to need to, but his eyes were clear, and his voice when he spoke was steady enough. "Don't," he said. Mu Rayon turned the pistol toward him. The transmitter on his lapel broadcast the moment to every contact watching the feed, the moment when the man once spent years building fear turned a gun on a 24-year-old logistics coordinator who had chosen to walk through the right door at the right time. The laptop bar completed, 100%. Somewhere across 6 jurisdictions, law enforcement servers received the complete documentation of 4 years of Mu Rayon's European operation, timestamped and authenticated and entirely sufficient. And outside the farmhouse, on the road that Mu Rayon's convoy had taken 30 minutes earlier, sirens began. Tae-jin heard them from his knee. He had known they were coming. He had calculated the timing, had built the plan around the timing, but hearing them arrive was something different from knowing they would arrive. The same way that understanding that something is true is different from experiencing it as true. He stayed on one knee until the sound fully resolved. Then he stood up. His shoulder was wrong and his mouth was full of blood, and 3 of the men who had attacked him were sitting on the kitchen floor for different reasons. And the laptop screen displayed a transmission confirmation in 4 languages, and Mu Rayon was still pointing a gun at Jun-suk, who was still standing in the doorway. Tae-jin looked at Jun-suk. The young man's hands were shaking. The gun was very close, and Tae-jin understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had spent 15 years reading rooms and the people in them, that Jun-suk did not yet know whether he was capable of what the situation might require, and that not knowing was the most dangerous state a person could occupy in a room with a loaded weapon. "You don't have to," Tae-jin said, his voice carrying across the kitchen with the specific voice of someone who had practiced making people hear him. "You only have to stop." Jun-suk's hands steadied by approximately half. Outside, the sirens had reached the dirt road. The farmhouse door was still open behind Jun-suk, and the cold Austrian afternoon was coming through it. And somewhere out there, Nyla Mercer was sitting in a car she hadn't chosen, with a daughter she had protected for 5 years and a dog who had been waiting his whole life for someone who wouldn't leave, and she did not yet know whether the farmhouse had held. But the sirens were getting closer, and Marion's gun, aimed at a young man who had walked through the right door, was the last decision point between the plan working and the plan becoming something else, entirely something that none of them had built a contingency for, because some contingencies cannot be planned around, only survived. The gun did not fire, not immediately. Mu Rayon held it aimed at Jun-suk for 3 seconds that felt like something much longer. And in those 3 seconds, the farmhouse contained a specific quality of silence that happened only when every person in a room understood that the next thing to occur would determine what kind of room it became. Jun-suk did not move. He stood in the open doorway with the cold Austrian afternoon behind him and his hands at his sides and his breathing audible, not panicked breathing, not the ragged hyperventilation of someone losing control, but the deliberate, conscious breathing of someone who had decided that breathing deliberately was the only thing they could control right now, and they were going to control it. Tae-jin watched Mu Rayon's trigger finger. There was a calculation happening behind Mu Rayon's eyes visible, if you knew how to read it, in the slight tightening around the orbital bone, the micro-adjustment of his grip. He was running numbers. He was assessing what shooting Jun-suk accomplished. In the next 30 seconds, given that the sirens outside had resolved into the specific sound of vehicles turning onto the property road, given that the laptop behind Tae-jin displayed a completed transmission in 4 languages, given that the transmitter on his lapel had been broadcasting to his network contacts for the past 4 minutes. Shooting Jun-suk accomplished nothing tactical, but Mu Rayon was past tactical. That was what Tae-jin had been watching for, and that was what he saw now, the moment when a calculating man ran out of calculations, and what remained was the older, rawer thing underneath. Not strategy, rage. The specific rage of a man who had spent years engineering a situation and had arrived at its conclusion to find it engineered against him. The gun moved, not toward Jun-suk, toward Tae-jin. "You knew," Mu Rayon said. His voice had changed register, still controlled but differently controlled, the way a wire is controlled when it's been pulled past its rated tension and is holding by material integrity alone. You were here the whole time. You knew I'd come. Yes, you used yourself. Yes, for them. Murion said it with a specific intonation, not contempt. Something more confused than contempt. The intonation of a man who has built his entire operational model on the premise that people protect assets and that personal attachments are liabilities, encountering evidence that this model had a gap in it. You knelt in front of my camera for a woman and a child. Yes, Tae-jin said. That's... Murion stopped. I know what you think it is, Tae-jin said. The vehicles outside had stopped. Doors opening. Voices in German, the specific clipped efficiency of law enforcement coordinating entry. Murion heard it. His men heard it. 3 of the men on the kitchen floor began making the calculations that men make when they understand that their employer's situation has become critically distinct from their own situation, and 2 of them had reached conclusions that required them to be somewhere other than the kitchen floor. One stood. Tae-jin moved before the man fully had his feet under him, not toward Murion, laterally, using the kitchen table as a pivot point, putting himself between the standing man and Jun-suk in the doorway. The man swung, and Tae-jin took it across the already damaged shoulder. He felt the joint and slide in a way that sent a specific message to his brain. The message being that the shoulder had made its last cooperative gesture, and everything from here would require overriding it. He overrode it. He drove the man back into the refrigerator hard enough that the refrigerator moved, and the sound it made against the floor tiles was enormous in the enclosed space, and the man slid down it and stayed down. Tae-jin's shoulder was now completely wrong. He could feel the wrongness as a specific absence. The place where his arm should have been connected to the rest of him felt approximate, like a connection maintained by habit rather than structure. He kept his arm moving because stopping it would mean acknowledging what stopping it meant, and he could not afford that acknowledgement yet. Murion still had the gun. He had not fired during the exchange with the refrigerator man, and Tae-jin understood why the transmitter on his lapel was still broadcasting. And whatever remained of Murion's strategic instinct understood that shooting Tae-jin on a live feed to his own network contacts in a farmhouse surrounded by Austrian law enforcement was not a recoverable position. But the gun was still up, and the men at the door, 3 of them, moving in the organized way of people who had received exterior communication that changed their calculus, were not carrying guns because they had been told to leave weapons in the vehicles to reduce the legal exposure of the initial entry. And this decision was now producing visible regret on all 3 faces. Jun-suk had moved from the doorway during the refrigerator exchange. He was against the wall to the right of the entrance, which was the tactically correct position, and which told Tae-jin that Jun-suk had either been trained at some point or had very good instincts. Hae-trin was still behind the laptop. She had her back against the server equipment and blood on her lip from a collision Tae-jin hadn't seen happen. And she was watching Murion with the expression of someone who has passed the point of fear and is now operating on something more primal. Outside, boots on gravel, Murion, Tae-jin said. The man looked at him. There are 12 officers outside. They have the documentation. They have your account numbers, your personnel files, your safe house locations, and your communication logs for 4 years. Tae-jin's voice was even. His shoulders was screaming. Transmission on your jacket has been broadcasting your face and your voice for 6 minutes to every significant contact in your network. They have watched you lose. They are watching right now. He held Murion's gaze. Put the gun down. Murion's face did something extraordinary. It cracked. Not dramatically, not the way faces crack in performances of emotion, with visible collapse and noise. It cracked the way very controlled. Things crack when the controlling force is removed, suddenly, completely, with a kind of finality that made the previous control seem, in retrospect, temporary. He was looking at Tae-jin, and he was also selecting something that wasn't in the room, some internal accounting that was coming up wrong, no matter how many times he ran it. He lowered the gun 6 inches, then he raised it again. The door came in. Not the farmhouse's front door. Jun-suk was still against the wall beside that one. The side door, the one that opened from the small utility corridor on the east side of the building. which Tae-jin had identified when he arrived at 9:17 that morning and had noted as the secondary entry point that any competent law enforcement team would use. 2 officers came through it fast and low, and the kitchen became a different kind of chaos, the organized, procedural chaos of a forced entry, with voices giving commands in German that required no translation. Murion turned toward the side door. He turned away from Tae-jin. It lasted 1 second. Tae-jin crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and hit Murion from behind, and the gun went one direction, and the transmitter went another direction, and the 2 of them went into the kitchen counter, and then the floor, and it was not elegant, and it was not controlled, and Tae-jin's shoulder had now exceeded every pain threshold he had, and was entering territory he had no language for. But he stayed on top of Murion and kept him down until one of the officers had a hand on each of them and was separating them with the impersonal efficiency of someone who had done this before. The gun was on the floor. The transmitter had stopped broadcasting when it hit the tile. Officers were in every room. Murion was face down with his hands being secured behind him, and he was saying something in Korean that Tae-jin didn't catch because of the noise and the blood in his ear that he hadn't noticed until now. Tae-jin sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet under the sink, and his legs straight out in front of him, and his right arm doing nothing, because asking it to do anything was not currently an option. Hae-rin appeared beside him. She crouched down and looked at his shoulder with the specific expression of someone assessing damage. "That needs a hospital," she said. "Later," he said. Tae-jin later. He looked around the kitchen. Jun-suk. Jun-sik was still against the wall. He had not moved during the entry, which was tactically correct, and which had apparently required significant self-control, because he was now shaking with the full-body tremor of someone who had been holding a great deal very still for a very long time. "You're all right," Tae-jin said across the room. Jun-suk looked at him. "You're all right," Tae-jin said again. Not a question. "The specific way you say something true, to someone who needs to hear it said." Jun-suk nodded once. Then he slid down the wall and sat on the floor, and that was fine. And an Austrian officer came over and spoke to him in careful, simplified German. And Jun-suk answered in the approximate German of someone who had been working in Central Europe long enough to be functional, and was grateful, right now, for any language that wasn't the one he normally operated in. Tae-jin closed his eyes for approximately 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, he took inventory. Shoulder, catastrophically compromised, but probably not dislocated. More likely a significant partial tear of something structural. Ribs on the left side, 2 or 3 were talking to him in a way that suggested they had strong opinions about the last 40 minutes. The blood in his mouth was from a lip, not anything internal, which was a category of good news. The cut above his eye had closed on its own. He had been in worse physical condition. He could not immediately remember when, but he was fairly certain he had. He opened his eyes. An officer was standing in front of him with an expression that managed to be simultaneously professional and deeply skeptical of the entire situation. "Kang Tae-jin," the officer said, "Yes. You will need to come with us." "I understand." He began the process of getting up, which required ignoring a significant amount of physical information. "I need to make one phone call first." The officer looked at him. "One call," Tae-jin said. "Then I will answer every question you have for as long as you need." The phone rang twice. Nyla answered on the second ring, which was how Tae-jin knew she had been holding the phone. "It's over," he said. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. "Morayon, in custody. His network is exposed. The documentation transmitted completely." Another silence. Shorter. "Are you hurt?" He considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Yes." "How badly?" "Hospital required. Not life required." She made a sound that was not quite a word. "Hae-rin is fine," he said. "Jun-suk is fine. The farmhouse is full of Austrian law enforcement, and I am about to spend several hours explaining things that I would rather not explain." "Tae-jin, are you and Mara all right?" "Yes, we're..." She paused. "We're fine. Mara is asleep in the back seat. Copper is taking up most of the floor space." "Good." He could hear his own voice doing something. He wasn't fully in control of some compression or roughness that came from places he wasn't going to identify while standing in a farmhouse kitchen surrounded by officers. Nyla, when this she said, not harshly. The way you say don't to someone when you know what they're about to do and you know it's the wrong moment. Not on the phone, not now. All right, he said. Tell me where they're taking you. He looked at the officer. The officer told him. He told Nyla. I'll come in the morning, she said. With Mara. He understood everything that was contained in that sentence, the conditional nature of it, the specific choice of morning rather than tonight, the inclusion of Mara, which was both practical and something more than practical. He understood that she was not coming because the situation was resolved. She was coming because the next part of the thing, the long, complicated, possibly impossible part, had to start somewhere. Thank you, he said. She hung up. The officer was still waiting with professional patience. Tae-jin put the phone in his pocket and followed the officer out of the kitchen, past the space where the refrigerator had moved 6 inches across the tile, past the laptop that was now being photographed by an evidence technician, past the transmitter on the floor that had broadcast Mu-rayon's unraveling to every significant contact in his network. He walked through the farmhouse door into the cold Austrian afternoon. The fields were the same pale gold they had been that morning when Nyla arrived. The light had shifted to the lower angle of late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything look slightly more significant than it was, which was either a mercy or an inconvenience depending on what you needed from the moment. Mu-rayon was in the back of a vehicle 40 meters away. Tae-jin did not look at him. He looked at the fields, and the road, and the tree line where the property ended. And then he got into the vehicle that was waiting for him, and he answered the first question they asked, and then the second, and then the questions continued. And he answered them all because he had decided on the flight from Seoul that transparency was the only available option, that the architecture of the old life was already dismantling itself, and there was no profit in defending its ruins. The processing took until 11 at night. Hae-rin was in a separate room doing her own version of the same thing, which went faster because her documentation was complete and pre-organized, and because she had been planning for this conversation for 6 weeks. Jun-suk was in a third room with a lawyer who had arrived 40 minutes after the initial entry, a lawyer that Song-ho had arranged from Seoul before Tae-jin's plane landed, which meant Seong-ho had anticipated the likelihood of this outcome and had prepared for it, which was entirely consistent with 30 years of knowing how Seong-ho operated. The officers were professional. They were also skeptical, which was appropriate given the scope of what they were being told. But the documentation was unimpeachable. 4 years of Hae-rin's careful accumulation, structured and cross-referenced and authenticated, and skepticism in the face of sufficient documentation eventually becomes something more like reluctant comprehension. Tae-jin's shoulder was examined by a medic at approximately 8 in the evening. The medic used the specific expression that medical professionals use when they are preventing themselves from commenting on how long a person has been functioning with an injury that required immediate attention. It needs imaging, the medic said. I know, and likely surgical intervention. I know. You've been operating with this for 4 hours, Tae-jin said. Is there something you can do now that helps in the next 12 hours? The medic did what could be done, which involved immobilization and something for the pain that Tae-jin accepted with the specific gratitude of someone who has been declining to notice how much pain they're in and has now been given permission to stop declining. The pain medication did not make him feel better. It made the pain approximately 33% less insistent, which was enough to allow him to think more linearly, which was what he needed. He sat in the processing room with one arm immobilized and his jacket over his shoulders and answered questions until there were no more questions. And then he signed documents until there were no more documents. And then an officer told him he was free to go but should remain in Austria pending further interviews, and he said he intended to. Song-ho called at 11:40. So Yeon, Tae-jin said before Song-ho could speak. Her access was frozen this morning, as you authorized. She left the building at approximately 10:15. A pause. We don't know where she went. She'll surface. Tae-jin said. She always does. Her financial exposure is documented. The authorities will find her. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Yes. The organization. He meant the criminal architecture, the empire that had taken 15 years to build, and that had spent the last several years being quietly hollowed out by the distraction of his search and the betrayal of his CFO. Begin the process. Which process? The one we talked about on the plane. He shifted his immobilized arm and felt the movement make an argument he ignored. Close it down. The parts that need closing. The legitimate operations survive. The rest Tae-jin. I know what it is, he said. I know what it costs. Do it anyway. Song-ho was quiet. All right, he said finally. And come to Vienna, Tae-jin said. Not now. In a few days, when the initial process with the authorities is further along. Come to Vienna. Why Vienna? Tae-jin looked out the window of the room he was in, which had a view of a parking structure and not much else. Because that's where we're going to be, he said. Nyla and Mara. That's where she's building something. He stopped. Started differently. I don't know what comes next. But whatever it is, it starts in Vienna. Song-ho said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, there was something in his voice that Tae-jin had heard only a small number of times across 30 years. A particular warmth that Song-ho normally stored somewhere very deep and produced only in circumstances that warranted it. I'll be there Thursday, Song-ho said. Thank you, Tae-jin said. He ended the call. He sat in the empty processing room until a different officer came to tell him a car was available to take him to the hospital. And he went, and the hospital imaging confirmed what the medic had suspected, and a surgeon explained what would be required, and when, and Tae-jin agreed to everything and asked one question, which was whether the procedure could wait until the following afternoon. The surgeon looked at him. Why tomorrow afternoon? Because tomorrow morning I have something that can't wait. The surgeon reviewed the imaging again. Tomorrow afternoon, she said. Not later. Not later, he agreed. He checked into the hospital room they gave him and sat on the edge of the bed with the lights off and his arm in its immobilization, and the pain medication doing its approximate work. And he sat there for a while with the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent 5 years in pursuit of something and had arrived at it, to find that the arrival was not an ending, but a beginning, and the beginning was going to require things that pursuit had not required. But pursuit required only persistence. What came next required something harder. He had spent 15 years building an identity around never needing anything. What came next required him to need something badly enough to say so. He lay down without taking his jacket off, because that operation was beyond him right now, and he stared at the ceiling of the hospital room, and at some point the exhaustion overrode everything else, and he slept. Nyla arrived at the hospital at 8:43 in the morning. She came with Mara, who was wearing her coat buttoned wrong, because she had done it herself, and with Copper, who was technically not permitted in the hospital, and whose presence Nyla had managed through the specific combination of confidence and selective blindness that she had refined over 5 years of doing. Things in public that were not strictly permitted. The nurse at the third-floor desk looked at Copper. Nyla looked at the nurse. The nurse looked at the chart in front of her. Room 318. The nurse. Thank you, Nyla said. The door to 318 was half open. She stopped in the hallway and looked through the gap before entering. The old instinct, and what she saw was Tae-jin sitting up in the hospital bed with his arm immobilized and his face carrying the specific quality of someone who had slept in their clothes and was not reconciled to it, and he was looking at the window, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had spent a very long night with his own thoughts and had not entirely won. She pushed the door open. He turned. Whatever he had been expecting, she could see him recalibrate when he saw Mara beside her, adjusting something in his posture, something in his expression, the specific adjustment of a person who is trying very hard not to perform, and is therefore more visible than usual. Mara looked at him. She looked at his immobilized arm. What happened to it? She said. I heard it yesterday, he said. Does it hurt now? Some. Mom knows how to fix things, Mara said. The complete confidence of it. The absolute matter-of-fact certainty of a 5-year-old who had watched her mother fix things for her entire conscious life. She fixed Copper's leg when he heard it. Tae-jin looked at Copper. Copper was investigating the corner of the room near the radiator with the professional thoroughness he applied to all new radiators. Is that right? Tae-jin said. She fixes lots of things, Mara said. She came further into the room, which she had apparently decided was an acceptable space, and looked at a hospital bed with the evaluative eye she applied to furniture. Can I sit on that, Mara? Nyla said. It's fine, Tae-jin said. He shifted over on the bed, managing the immobilized arm with practiced economy. Come up. Mara climbed up with the specific athleticism of a child who had learned to be economical with her body in small apartments, and sat beside him and looked at the window. There's nothing out there, she said. Parking structure, he said. That's boring. Yes. Nyla stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the two of them sitting there, Mara matter-of-fact. Tae-jin handling the specific novelty of a 5-year-old's proximity with the careful attention of a man trying very hard not to do anything wrong, and something moved through her that she had been holding at a distance for 24 hours. Because there had been no safe place to put it down. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was something earlier than either of those, the thing that has to exist before those other things become possible, the recognition that the person in front of you is real and present, and not the version of them you've been carrying in your head, and that the real present version requires a different response than the carried version did. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. Mara, she said, go find out if there's a water machine in the hallway. Mara looked at her. I'm not thirsty, she said. That's okay, Nyla said. Go find out anyway. Mara considered this for a moment, with the negotiating instincts she had apparently been born with. Then she climbed down from the bed and went into the hallway, and Copper, demonstrating his characteristic solidarity with Mara's movements, followed her. Nyla looked at Tae-jin. Tae-jin looked at Nyla. She's extraordinary, he said. Yes, I know what she looks like, Nyla said. Quiet, not cutting, just the acknowledgement of something she had been looking at for 5 years. I know. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that exists between people who have said enough things, finally that they can afford to not say things for a moment. The shoulder, she said. Surgery this afternoon. Are you scared? He looked at her. The question surprised him, not the content, but the directness of it, the way she asked things she actually wanted to know, rather than things she was supposed to ask. No, he said then, a little. That's honest. I'm trying to be honest, he said. More than I used to be. She looked at her hands for a moment. The exhale, she said. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. Tell me, she said, what it actually was. He was quiet for 4 seconds. Relief, he said. It was relief. But not. He stopped. Tried again. I had been trying to solve the problem for 6 weeks. The problem of keeping you safe. I had built the logic of it. The divorce removes you from the formal equation, removes you as a target with legal standing relative to my organizations. And when you signed him, she said, I believed I had finally done the right thing, he said. Not the easy thing. What I believed was actually right. And the relief was, his jaw moved. It was the relief of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and believes they have finally put it down properly. Nyla looked at him. You put me down, she said. Yes, he said. That is exactly what I did, and I told myself it was an act of protection. His voice did not waver. He had decided to say this without the usual controls. It was an act of control that I dressed in the language of protection, because I could not tolerate the alternative, which was admitting that I did not know how to keep you safe, and that not knowing frightened me more than anything else I had ever encountered. The room was very quiet. You were afraid, she said. Yes. And instead of telling me you were afraid, I made a unilateral decision. Yes. The door opened, and Mara came back in with a cup of water from a machine she had apparently located through sheer investigative determination and the assistance of a nurse who found her impossible to refuse. She handed the cup to Tae-jin. I wasn't thirsty either, she said. But you might be. He looked at the cup. He looked at his daughter's face, the specific gray of her eyes, the precise angle of her brow, the dark skin, and the composed expression of a child who had spent 5 years in circumstances that required composure. He took the cup. "Thank you," he said. Mara climbed back up on the bed with the efficiency of someone who had conducted her assigned task and was returning to her preferred position. Copper settled on the floor beside the radiator. Nyla sat in the chair and looked at Tae-jin and at her daughter sitting beside him, and the hospital room with its boring parking structure view and its functional efficiencies. And she thought about Prague and the cramped apartment and the 3 in the morning nights and the fake names and the bakery she had stopped going to. And she thought about the sound of sirens on a dirt road outside a farmhouse and the word that Si Song-ho had said on the phone over, which was not the same as finished. Over was a line. Finished was what happened after you crossed the line and looked back. They were at the line. What came after it was going to be complicated and slow and imperfect and full of moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. And she was not naive about that. She had spent 5 years stripping herself of naivety as a survival mechanism. But they were at the line. And her daughter was sitting next to her father in a hospital bed in Vienna, looking at a boring parking structure and telling him with the there was nothing, complete authority, that there was nothing interesting out there. And he was agreeing with her. And it was the most ordinary exchange she had witnessed in 5 years. She held on to it, not as resolution, as a beginning. And in the hallway outside room 318, she could hear the hospital doing its ordinary business, and somewhere across the city, Soyeon was making calculations Nyla didn't know about yet, and Murion was in a holding facility 40 minutes away, being processed by people who had enough documentation to keep him there for a very long time, and Jun-suk was somewhere with his lawyer and his uncertain future, and Hae-rin was in a hotel room writing the statement that would formally begin her cooperation with 6 jurisdictions, and Seong-ho was on a plane that would land Thursday. All of it was still in motion. But in room 318, for this specific morning, none of it was immediate. Nyla reached forward and straightened the blanket across Mara's legs, the automatic gesture of a mother who has done that gesture 10,000 times in 5 years of small apartments and train seats and cheap motel beds. And Mara said "mom" with the specific intonation that children use when they find parental attentions unnecessary. And Tae-jin watched this exchange with an expression on his face that had nothing controlled about it at all. He looked like a man who understood, for the first time, what he had been searching for. Not the woman, not even the child. The ordinary morning. The blanket being straightened. The child saying "mom." The specific small grammar of a life being lived instead of managed. Nyla looked up and caught him looking. She did not look away. He did not look away. "Surgery too," she said. "Yes. We'll be here when you come out." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything larger. It was a statement about the afternoon, and he received it as what it was. And he did not try to make it more than what it was, because he was learning slowly, imperfectly, in the specific way that people learn things they should have known earlier, that the thing she needed from him was not more decisions. It was this. "Just this, all right," he said. Mara leaned against his good shoulder. She didn't ask permission. She just leaned. And Kang Tae-jin, who had spent 15 years being untouchable and had discovered that untouchable was another word for unreachable, sat very still and let his daughter lean against him in a hospital room in Vienna with a boring parking structure outside the window, and did not move and did not speak, and breathed carefully around the pain in his shoulder and the considerably larger thing in his chest that had no clinical name but was present and specific and not going anywhere. Outside the door, the hospital continued, and the morning held. And neither of them knew yet what the afternoon would ask of them, or the week after that, or the year, but the morning was holding, and they were in it, and that was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. The surgery lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nyla knew this because she counted. Not obsessively, she had things to do while she waited, practical things, the kind of logistics that didn't stop requiring attention because the emotional situation had become large. She needed to arrange accommodation that wasn't a car with Hae-rin's contact. She needed to call the Prague clinic and explain her absence in terms that were both honest and limited. She needed to feed Copper, who had been patient about the hospital situation with the dignity of an old dog, who had learned that human logistics were complicated, and patience was the correct response. She did all of these things, and she counted 2 hours and 40 minutes. The surgeon came out at 4:17 and told her the procedure had gone well, and that Tae-jin was in recovery and would be moved to his room within the hour. She used the word we repaired. We addressed in the way surgeons did when they wanted to distribute the accomplishment across the team, and Nyla, who had spent enough years in medical environments to understand the grammar, appreciated it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. The surgeon looked at her with the expression of some prepared for any version of this question. "How long had he been operating with it?" Nyla said. The surgeon paused. "Based on the imaging and the degree of tissue response, at least 4 hours. Possibly longer." He didn't stop. "No," the surgeon said. "He did not," Nyla nodded. She went back to the waiting room where Mara was drawing on the back of a hospital pamphlet with a pen she had acquired, through methods Nyla hadn't tracked, and Copper was asleep under the chair when his muzzle on his paws and his breathing the slow, meditative rhythm of a very old dog who had decided that sleep was his contribution to the current situation. "Is he okay?" Mara said, without looking up from the pamphlet. "He's okay," Nyla said. "What did they do?" "Fix the shoulder." "How?" Nyla sat down and explained in the simplified but accurate terms she had always used with Mara what the surgery had involved. Mara listened with her pen. Still moving, she processed information best when her hands were occupied, which was something Nyla had noticed when she was 2 and had never stopped being true. "Like when you fix Copper's tendon," Mara said. "Similar principle," Nyla said. Mara nodded. She went back to drawing. Han So-yeon was found in Luxembourg on a Thursday. Not by law enforcement, they located her 3 days later, but by Seong-ho, who had spent 40 years developing the specific skill of knowing where people went when they believed they were disappearing, and who understood So-yeon well enough to know that her version of disappearing would involve a specific quality of comfort that significantly narrowed the options. He did not tell Tae-jin he was going to Luxembourg. He went, spoke with certain people, confirmed certain things, and came back. He told Tae-jin the result on the phone. "She's there," he said. "The authorities will have her by the weekend. The financial evidence is there's no version of this where she doesn't answer for it." Tae-jin was quiet for a moment. He was in the hospital room. It was 2 days after the surgery, and his shoulder was immobilized in the formal, structured way of post-operative immobilization, rather than the improvised way of the farmhouse afternoon. And he was sitting up in bed with better color than he'd had 48 hours ago, and the specific restlessness of a man who was not good at being still. "Did you talk to her?" he said. Song-ho paused. "Briefly," he said. "She was aware that I was there before I found her. She's very good." "What did she say?" Another pause. "She said she made the only calculation available to her, given what she understood about the organization and her position in it. And she said she doesn't regret it." Tae-jin looked at the window. The parking structure again. He had spent more time looking at that parking structure than any building deserved. "Do you believe her?" he said. "Yes," Song-ho said. "I think that's the most honest thing she said in 3 years." "Why?" "Because regret requires believing you had a better option," Song-ho said. So-yeon built her entire professional identity on the premise that attachment was a liability and leverage was the only reliable currency. She looked at you and Nyla, and she saw leverage and distraction. She wasn't wrong about what she saw. She was wrong about what it meant. A pause. But she doesn't know that yet. That's the kind of thing you learn slowly. Tae-jin said nothing. "She'll have time to learn it," Song-ho said. "In Luxembourg, and then wherever they take her from there." They ended the call. Tae-jin sat with the window and the parking structure and the particular silence of a hospital room in the afternoon, and he thought about So-yeon's calculation, the coldness of it, the patience of it, the 3 years of sustained performance, and he tried to find in himself some version of the anger he expected to feel. He found something more complicated than anger. He found, underneath the betrayal and the 3 years of sabotage searches, and the specific cruelty of what she had done to Mara's access to him without her or Mara knowing, a kind of exhausted comprehension. So Jan had learned the organization, the way the organization taught people to operate leverage, containment, the management of human beings as resources. She had learned it from him, from the environment he had built, from 15 years of watching a man run an empire on the principle that control was the only reliable form of safety. She had applied those lessons to him. He could not entirely blame her for the lessons. He sat with that for a while. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. He sat with it anyway. Song-ho arrived in Vienna on Thursday, as he had said he would. He came to the hospital first, which Tae-jin had not expected. He had expected Song-ho to check into his hotel, review whatever materials needed reviewing, conduct himself with the deliberate efficiency that had characterized 30 years of operating beside Tae-jin. Coming to the hospital first was not efficient. It was something else. He came in and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at Tae-jin with the expression he reserved for the small number of situations in 30 years where something real had happened. "You look terrible," Song-ho said. "I'm aware," Tae-jin said. "The shoulder will be functional in 6 to 8 weeks. The surgeon says complete recovery is possible with sufficient physical therapy." "Will you do the physical therapy?" "Yes." Song-ho looked at him. "You'll actually do it," he said, confirming something. "Yes," Tae-jin said. "I'm going to be here for a while. I need the arm to work." Song-ho nodded slowly. He looked around the hospital room with the methodical attention he applied to every space he entered, for the first-time exits, angles, the quality of the light, the organization of the furniture. Then he looked back at Tae-jin. "She came yesterday," Tae-jin said. "I know. I spoke with her this morning." Tae-jin looked at him. She called me," Song-ho said. "She had questions about the organizational transition, about what closing certain operations actually means for the people who work in them, the legitimate workers, the ones who have been operating in the legal businesses without full knowledge of everything else." He paused. She was asking on their behalf. She wanted to know if they'd be protected. Tae-jin was quiet. "That's what she called you about," he said. "First thing," Song-ho said. "Yes." Tae-jin looked at the window. He had been thinking about Nyla's call yesterday. She had brought Mara again, and Mara had informed him, with considerable authority, that the parking structure had exactly 47 visible cars in it because she had counted, and he had found himself counting with her from the window, and it had been the most purely absorbing 12 minutes he had experienced in recent memory. After Mara had taken Copper to investigate the corridor, Nyla had sat in the chair, and they had talked about the organizational transition. Not personally, practically. She wanted to understand what the dismantling would mean, the timeline, the people affected, the legal exposure. She had not asked him why he was doing it. She knew why. She was asking how, which was the more useful question. "She's practical," Song-ho said, reading something in Tae-jin's expression. "She's always been practical," Tae-jin said. "I used to mistake it for simplicity." "It's the opposite." Song-ho nodded. He folded his hands. "Tae-jin," he said. "I know," Tae-jin said. "You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to say that the transition is going to take longer than I've told myself. That there are people in the organization who won't accept it cleanly. That there will be legal processes that outlast my patience. That rebuilding on legitimate foundations while the old structure is still partially standing is the most dangerous kind of construction." He looked at Song-ho. "And you're going to say that you'll help, that you've always helped, and that you need me to tell you what I actually want, so that you can build toward it instead of guessing." Song-ho regarded him. "That was accurate," he said. "I've known you for 30 years, Tae-jin said. "What do you actually want?" Tae-jin looked at the parking structure. 47 cars. He and Mara had counted 47. "I want to be in the same city as my daughter," he said. "I want to stop being a reason that she can't be safe. He stopped. "I want to learn who she is. She's 5 years old, and I don't know her. I know she counts things. I know she's like her mother in ways that are going to make her life very interesting. I know she makes decisions about people quickly and trusts those decisions completely, and that this is either going to serve her very well or cost her." He paused. "I want time to find out." Song-ho looked at him for a long moment. That's enough, Seong-ho said. I can build toward that. Copper died on a morning in January, 2 years after Vienna. He had been slowing for months, in the specific way that very old dogs slow, less interested in new radiators, less invested in the morning's investigative possibilities, content to remain in the warmth of whatever room the family occupied, and to breathe with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a creature winding down with dignity. Nyla had known it was coming. Knowing did not make it easier, which was something she had told owners 100 times across her career and had never stopped being true. He went on a Tuesday morning, in the living room of the house they had found outside Vienna, a house with a garden, on a street quiet enough for Mara to walk to the corner without supervision, with enough room for the 2 rescue animals who had arrived in the months after the farmhouse and who were currently watching from the doorway, with the careful distance that animals maintain around processes they understand, but cannot help. Nyla sat on the floor beside him. Tae-jin came and sat beside her without being asked. Mara sat on Copper's other side and put her hand on his flank and did not say anything, which was unusual for her. But she understood, she had always understood things, before she had language for them. Copper's breathing slowed, then it stopped. It was quiet and it was gentle, and it was the most ordinary devastating thing. Nyla sat with her hand on his side for a while after. Tae-jin put his arm around her the repaired shoulder. Functional now, reliable, and she leaned into it. Sixums, fit. And they sat on the living room floor with their daughter, and the 2 watching animals and the January light coming through the window, and nobody said anything for a long time. Eventually Mara said quietly, he waited. What? Nyla said. He waited until we stopped leaving, Marissa said. He knew we weren't going to leave anymore. So he stopped waiting. Nyla looked at her daughter's face. 7 years old now. The gray eyes had deepened, not lighter with age, as some children's eyes went, but richer, more complex, the color of deep water. Yes, Nyla said. I think that's right. They buried him in the garden. Tae-jin dug the hole himself, working with the careful economy of someone who had learned in the year since Vienna that physical work was not beneath him, and was in fact one of the few things that organized his thinking when his thinking needed organizing. His shoulder held. He dug until the depth was right, and then he called Mara, who placed a drawing in the ground beside Copper, a drawing of the 4 of them, and Copper, the family portrait she had been making in various versions since the farmhouse. Nyla said a few words, not formal words, the kind of words you said to a living thing that had stayed with you through the worst years, that had slept against your legs in cheap motels and train seats and a cramped Prague apartment, that had eaten the pieces of Mara's first birthday cake that fell on the floor and had been the only other breathing presence on the nights when breathing presences were what stood between Nyla and the specific. Loneliness of people who have been running too long. Thank you, she said, for staying. The words were simple. Simple was what she had. Mara was 17 when she found the box. She was not supposed to be going through the storage room, not because it was forbidden, exactly, but because the storage room was the particular kind of room that accumulates the things a family hasn't fully decided what to do with yet. And Mara, who was 17 and had her mother's precision and her father's absolute refusal to leave things unexamined, had decided on a Saturday afternoon that the storage room needed to be organized. Nyla heard her moving things for about 40 minutes before the moving stopped. Then Mara called from the storage room doorway, "Mom." Her voice had a quality in it that Nyla recognized, the specific quality of a person who has found something that requires recalibration. Nyla came to the doorway. Mara was holding a cardboard box that had been at the back of a shelf, behind a collection of Nyla's veterinary school textbooks and a box of Mara's early drawings that they had kept, because Nyla could not bring herself to throw away evidence of Mara at 5 and 6 and 7. "Whose is this?" Mara said. Nyla looked at the box. She had not opened it herself. Tae-jin had brought it to Vienna in the 2nd year and placed it on the shelf without comment, and she had understood, without asking, that it was his and that he would address it when he was ready, and that he would address it when he was ready, and that ready might take time. "Ask your father," she said. Tae-jin was in the garden when Mara brought him the box. He was doing the thing he did on Saturday afternoons when the weather permitted, tending the section of the garden that had become, without particular plannings, a space for the rescue animals. 3 currently, which was 2 more than Nyla had said they would have, and 1 fewer than Mara would have preferred. The garden was ordinary vegetables along the south fence, flowers Mara had planted with aggressive optimism along the east, the apple tree that had been there when they bought the house, and produced fruit with reliable inconsistency. He looked at the box in Mara's hands. She looked at him. "Is this yours?" she said. "Yes. Can I know what's in it?" He set down the tool he was holding and took the box from her and carried it to the garden bench and sat down. Mara sat beside him with the particular patience she had when she understood that something required patience. He opened the box. Inside a journal. Notebooks. Actually 3 of them, different sizes, filled with his handwriting in a combination of Korean and English that shifted depending on what he was trying to say, because some things only organized themselves in one language and some in the other. Beneath the notebooks, a small envelope. He picked up the envelope. He held it for a moment. Then he held it out to Mara. "Your mother's name is on it," he said, "but I think she should read it with you." Mara looked at the envelope. "What is it?" "Something I wrote a long time ago," he said. "When I was still looking for you. When I was trying to understand what I had done wrong." "And did you?" she said. "Understand?" He looked at her. 17 years old. The gray eyes that had deepened into something clear and specific and entirely her own, though they carried his structure. Composed directness of someone who had grown up in a household where honesty was considered more respectful than comfort. Eventually, he said, "Not all at once." "What was it?" she said. "The thing you did wrong." He thought about this. He had thought about it many times over the years, in many different formulations, and the formulations had gotten more precise as the years gave him distance, and the distance gave him something like accuracy. "I believed that knowing what was best for someone was the same as loving them," he said. "I believed that protection and partnership were the same thing." He looked at the garden. "They're not. Protection can happen without the other person's knowledge. Partnership can't. And when I chose protection over partnership, when I decided alone, I didn't stop loving your mother. But I stopped treating her like someone whose voice in her own life was as important as my strategy for keeping her alive." Mara was quiet. "And now," she said. "Now I know the difference," he said. "Most days I manage to live by it. Most days," she said. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I've never been perfect. Your mother will confirm this." The corner of Mara's mouth moved. "She already has," she said. He looked at her. "Multiple times," Mara said. "In detail. She's very thorough." He held her gaze. Then he laughed. Not the controlled, managed expression that had been his public face, for most of his adult life a real laugh, the slightly rough, unpracticed kind that happened when something caught him genuinely off guard. And it was not elegant, and it didn't need to be. And Mara watched it happen with the expression she had worn since she was 5 years old in a farmhouse doorway, the expression that said she was cataloging something for later. "She is," he agreed. Nyla read the letter in the garden. It was October, and the light had the specific amber quality of autumn in Central Europe, the kind that made everything look like it was being seen through old glass, warm and slightly distant, and entirely its own. Mara was inside, doing something Nyla hadn't tracked. Tae-jin was beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the presence of him, but not touching, giving her the reading as her own thing, which he had learned across the years was how she needed certain things. The letter was 8 pages. His handwriting was smaller than usual, compressed the handwriting of someone trying to say a great deal in the space available. Not because they were cramped, but because they had been thinking about it for a long time, and there was simply a great deal to say. He had written it. The date at the top indicated 14 months after she disappeared. He had been in Tokyo, at a hotel, after a lead that had evaporated like every other lead, and he had ordered room service that he didn't eat and sat at the desk and written 8 pages that he had written and sent, because he didn't know where to send them. He told her about the cities. Tokyo, Berlin. Prague the first time 3 months before she settled there, so close and not close at all. Budapest, Lisbon. The specific hotel rooms that blurred into each other. the operatives he had hired, and the disappointments they had produced, and the way each disappointment reconfigured something in him, until what had started as operational frustration became something he had to sit with more honestly. He told her about the night he had understood what she had meant, about the exhale. He had been in a hotel room in Frankfurt, and the specific quality of the silence, the anonymity of the room, the fact that he had been in this room for 3 days, and not a single person on earth knew whether he was well or unwell, or simply whether he existed, had made him understand what untouchable felt like from the inside. It felt like being alone, he wrote. It felt like I had constructed a fortress and sealed myself inside it, and called the ceiling strength. And what I discovered in Frankfurt on a Wednesday night in October was that the fortress was also a cell, and had been for a very long time, and the only person who had ever made me aware of being inside it was you, because you were the only person I had ever allowed close enough to the walls for me to see them from the outside. He told her about the ultrasound photograph. He told her that he carried it in his jacket pocket for 14 months after Seong-ho gave it to him, and that he took it out sometimes in those hotel rooms and looked at it, not with hope. Hope had started to feel dangerous by then, but with a kind of factual accounting of what he had done. He told her that he had spent 15 years believing that power was the same as safety. He had been wrong. Power was the ability to prevent external threats from reaching you. Safety was different. Safety was what you felt in a room with a person you trusted. He had had power for 15 years. He had felt safe, he wrote, in the specific way he meant the word, very rarely, and only ever with her. He told her about the engraving. He had chosen it on the day he bought the rings. He had asked for that specific phrase, because he had been, even then, even in the years when their relationship was new, and the future felt long and uncomplicated, aware at some level that his world was not a world that guaranteed continuity. He had wanted her to have something that acknowledged that love was not a function of presence, that it didn't require the same room to remain true. He had not known, writing those words into the ring, how hard they would be tested. He had not known how far the meeting again would have to travel before it arrived. He closed the letter with something that had none of the formal architecture of the pages. Before it, a few lines, his handwriting larger and less controlled, as though he had been writing for a long time, and the control had gradually worn through. Whatever you have decided about us, I hope you have let yourself be something other than careful sometimes. I hope Mara has seen you be something other than strong. I hope that there has been someone, a friend, a neighbor, a dog who has given you the ordinary thing, the boring, mundane, ordinary thing, that I should have understood was the whole point. I am going to keep looking, not because I believe I deserve to find you, but because the alternative is stopping, and I am not ready to stop. Nyla sat with the letter in her hands for a long time after she finished reading. The garden was doing its ordinary October thing. The apple tree was mostly bare. The animals had gone inside an hour ago with the infallible timing of creatures who understood weather better than people did. The amber light was going blue at the edges, the shift from afternoon to evening happening the way it always happened, gradually and then completely. She turned the envelope over. The ring was inside. She had known. It would be. Mara had mentioned it before she came out, in the brief, precise summary that Mara gave of things, when she understood the information was necessary without yet understanding the weight of it. Nyla tipped the ring into her palm. It was exactly as she remembered it. White gold, simple, the engraving inside the band that she hadn't looked at in 5 years, because she had left it in the Prague apartment in a decision she had not entirely examined, and which she understood now, holding the ring again, had been a decision about keeping herself from the weight of the thing rather than a decision about the thing itself. She read the engraving. Until we meet again. She closed her fingers around it. Beside her, Tae-jin was still giving her the silence. He was looking at the apple tree, with the expression he used when he was thinking about something other than what appeared to be in front of him, and she had learned over the years to recognize the difference, the specific angle of his head, when his thoughts had taken him somewhere, and he was allowing her whatever the moment needed without filling it. Tae-jin, she said. He turned. She held up the ring. He looked at it. He looked at her. The exhale, she said. I know what it was now. I've known for a while. She paused. I just needed to hear you say it. I know, he said. It took me a long time to ask. I know that too. She looked at the ring in her palm. I'm not putting this back on right now, she said. I want you to know that's not a statement about where we are. It's a statement about the fact that some things need more time than other things, and I've spent enough of my life making decisions faster than was good for me. Yes, he said. But I'm keeping it, she said. That's also a statement. He held her gaze. I understand the difference, he said. She closed her fingers around the ring again and put her hand in her pocket and felt the specific weight of it there, not heavy, actually lighter than she remembered, but present in the way that small, significant things were present, the way they communicated something through the palm without requiring articulation. From inside the house came Mara's voice, calling something ordinary about dinner and whether anyone had remembered to buy the bread, and Tae-jin called back that he had bought bread yesterday and it was in the second cupboard, and Mara said that was not where the bread went, and Tae-jin said it was where he had put it, and Mara said that didn't mean it was where it went. And Nyla sat on the garden bench and listened to this exchange and felt something in her chest that had been wound very tight for a very long time ease by a fraction. Not release, ease. A fraction. It was enough. She stood and picked up the letter and the envelope and carried them inside, into the warmth of the kitchen, where Mara was standing at the counter, with the architectural certainty of someone who had already decided where everything was supposed to be, and was in the process of returning the bread to that location. And Tae-jin was watching this with the expression he reserved for moments, when being corrected by his daughter was the finest thing happening in the room. And the two rescue animals were positioned with the strategic optimism that animals used in kitchens where cooking was beginning. Nyla set the letter on the table. She looked at her family. There were no guards at the door. There was no packed bag on the closet floor. She did not check the exits. She pulled out a chair and sat down. The bread goes in the third cupboard, she said. Your father has been putting it in the second cupboard for 2 years, and I have been moving it. Mara turned and stared at her. You knew I always know, Nyla said. Tae-jin looked at her. Always, he said. She said. I just choose which things to address. He absorbed this. What else? He said. What else have you been choosing not to address? She looked at him across the kitchen table. In the October evening in the house outside Vienna, in the ordinary complicated life they had been slowly, imperfectly building in the years, since a farmhouse in Austria held long enough for it to become possible. You want a list, she said. No, he said. Smart, she said. Mara made a sound that was approximately laughter. She put the bread in the third cupboard and began taking other things out for dinner with the efficient purposefulness of someone who had been running her mother's kitchen since she was old enough to be trusted with sharp objects, which in Mara's case had been considerably earlier than was strictly advisable and had been non-negotiable anyway. Tae-jin got up to help. Nyla watched him, his shoulder moving correctly now, healed into function, if not entirely into the original, the specific way he had learned to occupy the kitchen over 2 years of being in it. No longer the careful guest behavior of the first months, but something more settled, more habitual, the way a space looked when a person had stopped performing being in it and was simply there. He looked up and caught her watching. She did not look away. What? He said. Nothing, she said. I'm just looking. He looked back at what he was doing. She kept looking. Outside, the garden was dark now. The apple tree was a shape against the darker sky. Somewhere beyond the fence, the street conducted its ordinary evening business neighbors. A car, the occasional voice. No sirens, no surveillance on the corner, no false names. Nyla put her hand in her pocket and felt the ring there, in the pocket of the ordinary sweater she wore, in the ordinary kitchen of the ordinary house that she had chosen, in the ordinary city, where she had built a practice that was now in its 3rd year, with 3 veterinarians and a waiting list and a reputation for taking the cases that other practices found complicated. Complicated cases were her specialty. They had always been. She took her hand out of her pocket. She did not check the exits. She got up and went to help with dinner, and the kitchen held the 3 of them, and the ordinary sounds of cooking, and the ring was in her pocket where she had put it, and outside the house the October night did what October nights did, and inside The light was on and the bread was in the third cupboard, and Mara was telling Tae-jin with considerable specificity why he had been doing the onions incorrectly, and he was listening, and Nyla stood beside them and listened too. And it was domestic and ordinary and imperfect and entirely enough, and there was nowhere else she needed to be. She was home. She had been for a while now. She was just done pretending otherwise.